Chapter 1402. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1402. All time. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's sharp eyes seemed to pierce through everything. Every time he threw, 3 would die, his bow force leaving blazing trail through the black and foggy skies. He soared through the skies, his javelin containers following in his wake. The chasm fire lions opened their mouths, sending beams of black fire shooting for Lionel. However, as though he couldn't see them at all. His right foot stepped forward, his left arm shooting forward once again. The needles whizzed by, bypassing the arc of flames that seemed to appear before Lionel in the blink of an eye. Lionel didn't elevate too high off the ground. The moment he tried to, he felt a strong pressure. It was clear that the void trials wouldn't allow him to just easily cheat his way to victory by plucking them off from above. In real life, just flying into the skies wouldn't be convenient. The air often had even more savage and primal enemies waiting. Due to this, it wasn't difficult in the slightest for him to be attacked. In fact, since he could only fly 3 meters up, his javelin containers seeming to be an exception as they could go much higher, it was still quite easy for even physical attacks to be launched at him. Bang! The beams of fire seemed to completely envelop Lionel. But, when the air cleared, the fire had suddenly shot into a single palm, forming a concentrated ball of fire in Lionel's hand. To try and play around with fire before him? It seemed that these lions overestimated themselves a bit too much. What Lionel didn't know was that his actions had shocked those on the outside. No matter how high your affinity, you shouldn't be able to so easily snatch force in the control of another being. And yet, Lionel had done it as though it was as simple as breathing. This was a hidden power of the mage core that Lionel hadn't realized was so abnormal. But very soon, the entire world would know that those with fire affinity should steer clear of the Morales family's littlest nova. His palm flared, the ball of fire splintering into a dozen controlled and concentrated javelins. Lionel's spear force and bow force surged. With a wave of his hands, the javelins shot forward, all 12 piercing into the body of the largest chasm fire lion. A roar of pain and horror resounded as the lion was suddenly enveloped by its own fire, its body incinerating from the inside out. In its final moments, it thrashed about, slapping some of the smaller lions to death. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. New novel chapters are published on NovelBin. Lionel didn't even pay attention to the death of the lion. He was systematic and cold. He attacked once. His confidence was such that he didn't need to double-check. He crashed into the first line of charging beast, tilting the tower shield he was riding upward and slamming down hard. Bang! The head of the lion imploded, but Lionel had already brought out a dagger from his thigh, whipping it to the side. A lion whose mouth had opened wide to bite Lionel's head off found its throat greeted by a flying dagger laced with bow force. The dagger shot through the back of its skull as though it was butter, spiraling through the air and curving through the head of a second lion. At some unknown time, a needle had appeared between Lionel's teeth. His chest expanded, his eyes flashing as a belly full of air jetted out. A line of crimson flames and bow force followed, tearing a line through the lions that had tried to bear down on him from the front. 3 lions found themselves imploding one after another, their flesh as fragile as wet paper. Lionel's palm opened, his thrown dagger snapping back into place, only for another flick of his wrist to send it flying through another skull. Lionel's wrist throws weren't as powerful as his full body throw, but what was undeniable was the fact they still had their own powerful strength, and how could they not? A spearman without powerful wrists was a weak spearman. Barely several minutes had passed, but Lionel wiped the entirety of the first floor, standing unmoving. There were several leaderboards that lined the outside of the Void Palace. New records were divided into whether it was a first or later attempt. In addition, because of the randomness of the Void Tower, they were also divided into floor types. There were clear records for single floors and tiers. Tiers referred to groups of 10 floors, where Lionel was currently within the first. The Beast Horde leaderboard shifted. It was a list dominated by those who controlled large area of effect attacks and archers for obvious reasons. And yet, there was no clear on a first attempt faster than Lionel's own. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net visit, Mybo X Novel. Com, to read, please. However, this leaderboard only contained those who were currently disciples of the Void Palace. There was always a duplicate leaderboard for all-time measurements. However, it was very rare for this leaderboard to move. And, even if there were movements, it would be deep into the hundreds upon a leaderboard that only displayed 1,000 to begin with. Today, though, that changed. Top 100. No one here could remember the last time there had been a change that high. The surroundings had fallen silent for quite a while now, but it seemed even more all-encompassing than before. However, this shock only lasted for a moment before it was overwhelmed by another. The leaderboards moved again, but this time, it wasn't for the sake of Lionel. And then, it shifted again, once again, not for the sake of Lionel. Under the shocked gazes of those watching, the leaderboard for forest goblins and stone maze began to shift as well. Both Amory and Aina had set their own records. However, Aina's, being the only one of them without a single injury, set an eye-popping number none were quite ready for. Forest Goblins, first attempt, all time. Chapter 1403. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 44 seconds AM. Chapter 1403. Efficiency. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The shock was palpable. The forest goblin floor was exceptionally difficult not only because of the strength of the enemies, but more importantly due to their stealth. Just finding the targets took time, let alone dealing with their assault once they were done. No one was sure how Aina did it. She seemed to just stumble onto her targets one after another, and even when most would have thought that the floor was cleared, she continued to attack and took out several more before finally putting down her axe. In the end, she was only 3 seconds away from surpassing the previously long-held record, and that was set by a person from a family so in tune with nature and greenery that the plants practically spoke to her. The idea that Aina would come even close to such a feat was baffling to the point of being difficult to accept. However, it felt like today would be a day the world lost its logic. Stone Maze, first attempt, all time, 3 youths, 3 new records, all set back to back to back. It was more than just a little difficult to accept, it bordered on ridiculous. When they had said that there was something special about this generation, the truth was that only the older generations had taken it seriously. The youths, however, snorted at the prospect. They had been on the front lines, slaving for the Void Palace every day. Why would they suddenly move to the side obediently so that these youths could take their spot? In truth, most of them had just directly ignored the rumors. They felt that once their juniors stepped foot in this place, they would quickly learn their place and realize whatever genius they had on the outside wasn't worth much here. However, now, they fell into silence. There were no longer any jeers, no longer any talks of beauty leaderboards, there was only a quiet brewing. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. This chapter is updated by Novelbin. It seems that they would have to put some more effort into showing these juniors exactly where their place was in the hierarchy. What was a military without strict rules? What was a military without strict hierarchy? The sooner these juniors learned exactly how well they placed, the better. Of course, while there were many with these thoughts, there were also a few faction leaders who licked at their lips, already communicating with their networks to see how many resources they could move around to pull these geniuses into their fold. However, in that time, when people were shocked awake by their thoughts, they were suddenly stunned to find that Lionel was actually getting faster rather than slowing down. They had been shocked by the appearance of Aina and then subsequently Amory. They hadn't even noticed that in the time it had taken them to clear the first floor, Lionel had already long since moved on and stepped onto the fourth. Each floor should have been getting more difficult. No one could wrap their heads around why Lionel was only getting faster. Was it because he hadn't been trying earlier? Was he not aware that there were records on the line? These leaderboards weren't just for show. Those that could enter the top 3 would gain equivalent resources for as long as they maintained it. These rewards were even more plentiful when it was the all-time leaderboard. For Lionel to be taking it easy wasn't cool, it was foolish. What these people didn't know, though, was that Lionel really was unaware of the leaderboard. But, even so, he wasn't taking it easy. He's becoming more efficient. Cornelius thought to himself. This thought was the very same thought every individual in the crowd who had a calculative ability or mind concluded. And, the more they observed, the more lost they seemed to become in Lionel's art. Lionel never used more effort than the last time. Yet his needles became faster, the arcs of his daggers became sharper, and when he finally brought out a javelin, this chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net follow current novels on Novelbin. Lionel's chest expanded, his gaze lighting with a fiery light. His hips locked into place, his thighs bulging and his torso tightening to the point his body became a wall of steel. His left arm cocked back, his wrist stabilized, his forearm flexing and his shoulder coming to a grinding halt as he reached back as far as his flexibility would allow. He locked eyes on a towering red-scaled python slithering up 20 meters into the sky, not even counting its coiled and stabilizing base. And then the world seemed to split. Foo! Bang! The javelin shot out from Lionel's grip like an iron ball out of a cannon. The air imploded and violent concentric circles of wind quickly formed, only to be left behind in an instantaneous blink. Bang! The scales of the python split before the javelin even landed. And, by the time it did, a hole with a 3-meter diameter was blasted through its skull. Lionel broke the 2-minute mark, and yet he was completely oblivious. He had already moved up from 58th to 1st on 2 all-time leaderboards, but his eyes seemed to still be calculating, spinning at speed most couldn't understand. He wanted more efficiency, greater efficiency, and it wasn't without reason. These beasts had only ever been at the 5th dimension and Lionel simply didn't believe that things would continue like this. The Void Palace was far too sadistic to allow anyone to reach the galaxy rank while just displaying 5th dimensional strength. If he couldn't become efficient, he would quickly find himself ruined. Just as advertised, the moment the horde of the 5th floor appeared, Lionel's gaze narrowed, his vision coming into very sharp focus. It was another group of reptilian serpents, but they all had bat-like wings and spewed acid from their mouths. However, this wasn't too much to accept. What was difficult, though, was that they were all outrageously fast and each and every one had entered the 6th dimension. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1404. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 1404. All out. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel exhaled a breath. He tested the range of his elevation height again, just to see if he was locked into his same rules and quickly found out that the answer was yes. That much was still fine. The point of the shield he was riding on wasn't to escape, the only purpose it served was to allow Lionel to maneuver and throw at the same time. It was easier to do it like this than it would be with his wings because it could counterbalance his downward force with upward thrust. The air pressure shifted, the atmosphere is different, the anarchic force concentration has raised. Lionel's mind began to calculate once more, adjusting his effective range, his throwing speed, and the output of force that would minimize his stamina drain while maximizing lethality. It was all completed in the blink of an eye. Lionel zipped forward in the next, his left hand reaching for his body once against and pulling out 6 long needles, nestling 2 apiece to 3 gaps between his fingers. His gaze turned cold and the world seemed to be covered in numbers. His arm whipped forward, releasing all 6 needles at once. But through the air, it truly looked as though there were only 3. They flew so close together and so perfectly that they might as well have been flying as one. However, in a blink, one had surpassed the other, zooming forward with a burst of acceleration the other simply didn't have. Even with this change, it looked just the same. 3 streaks through the skies, each just as blinding and powerful as the other. They arcs through the air as one, curving through the air until they hit their targeted 3 different flying serpents, each right beneath the jaw. Pung! 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 The needles collided with their targets and then sprung away as though meeting steel walls. Lionel's bow force might as well have been a splash of water to them. However, just as quickly as this occurred. PCHU. 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 This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed, visit Novelbin. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the second line of 3 needles landed in the exact same spot, skewering the flying serpents. However, Lionel only shook his head. With his sharp eyes, he could see that the needles had only penetrated a part of the way through, taking advantage of what had been a micro tear. But the flying serpents were only knocked back for a moment and hardly felt the attack, let alone dying from it. That was part of the reason, despite his skill in throwing, Lionel always gravitated back toward a bow. The effort to power output of a bow was simply on an entirely different level. He had gone all out with that throw just now, but had barely pierced skin. To make matters worse, in order to maximize his control of these shields and these throwing objects, he had chosen the former to be at the 4th dimension and the latter to be at the 5th. Lionel obviously didn't have telekinetic abilities. He was using his Earth variant affinity to control these metals to do his bidding. If he could only throw weapons, but not retrieve them, he would very quickly run out. And, holding all of these weapons wasn't nearly as good as having a single spatial treasure that only held arrows like he had seen this damn tower provide. So, because his weapons were only at the 5th dimension, they had an even harder time piercing skin. Of course, the Void Tower didn't allow you to just choose weapons of whatever dimension you wanted. But, here, the 6th dimension was considered standard. Lionel had to purposely demote himself to maximize his chances. The Raypax had really done a good job of screwing him this time around. Lionel could only sigh. There's only one way. I guess I have to stop worrying about stamina and resource consumption. Lionel swerved out of the way of a projectile of acid, his gaze glowing. Runes began to appear within his irises one after another. First 1, then 2, then 4, then 8. The space around him trembled. Lionel's fingers flicked backward, causing the 3 needles that had been knocked off course to rush back to his hands. He snagged them out of the air and threw them back with even more force than before. This time, however, they left a trail of crimson in their wake, a burning inferno threatening to melt everything in its path, erupting. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net SS Novel, B, in. XSS. The 3 needles landed exactly where they had originally, driving into the butt of their stuck counterparts. There was nothing the flying serpents could do to dodge this. Scree! Bang! An enormous hole was ripped through their throats and out the back of their skulls. Lionel exhaled a light breath, steam pushing out through his teeth and lips, red flickering within his irises. He had already pushed himself to the limit once today and managed to get back on his feet. But, since then, he had fought a battle with Amory, then used several hours to draw an array back to the human domain. With the current state of his mind, sustaining 8 destruction runes was a tall order. And it only made it worse that once he used it, the object he had used it on would be finished and vanish for good. Lionel had a few hundred throwing knives and objects, but facing beast hordes, he didn't know if it would last even 3 more floors, and he still wasn't sure exactly how far he had yet to travel. But facing this opportunity, there was only one real path to take. He had to go all out. Lionel's chest heaved, the daggers he plucked away from his hip already glowing a fiendish shade of red before he even finished imbuing them with his mark. You annoying spitting snakes put me in this situation, come die then. Lionel unleashed a barrage of relentless assaults, razing everything to the ground. There was nothing elegant and beautiful about his efficiency any longer. He saw a target, and he destroyed it from the inside out. Nothing more, nothing less. Chapter 1405. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 41 seconds AM. Chapter 1405. 9th floor. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel breathed heavily. His body was still fine, not having suffered any wounds just yet. But anyone who had been watching him battle previously would notice quite a striking difference. You could actually see the skin-tight black fabric that wrapped around him, making his arms sling and useless right arm all the more obvious. Lionel had been right. By the end of the 7th floor, he had run out of flying daggers and needles, making his life a living hell on the 8th. It had taken him almost 10 minutes to clear the whole of the 8th floor, and the 9th floor started off even worse. The beasts from the 5th floor to this point had all been in Tier 1 of the 6th dimension, however they had all been relatively weak and easier to handle. If Lionel had to describe it, it wasn't quite like what fighting 6th-dimensional experts from the Milky Way would feel like, but it was only barely a step above. The difficulty of these towers obviously wasn't in quality, at least not for this version. It was more so in quantity. Until the 9th floor, that is. Lionel was suddenly faced with a horde of blue-furred, four-armed apes. Runes flickered about their bodies, giving Lionel a sort of stifling feeling, as though no matter how hard he attacked them, he would never be able to break through their defenses. Lionel didn't quite understand where these runes were coming from, if they were similar to his own destruction runes, or something entirely different. But, once he stepped into the God path, he would understand what these runes represented and exactly why it was Conan had said stepping into the 6th dimension would help them all to close the gap between themselves and Lionel's innate node. These were indeed runes similar to Lionel's destruction runes, and they were, indeed, primed toward defense. And yes, that did mean that Lionel's task had suddenly become another living nightmare. Shit. It would suffice to say that Lionel's record-breaking streak had come to an end. They could all see it. But they could also see the reasons why this was. No one knew the details of this year's true selection, but it had caused a major commotion that resulted in even Void Senate members clashing heads. Just looking at Lionel and Amory, it was clear that the both of them had taken this the hardest. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. The latest _AP _SODIs are on the NOVL by N website. But, by contrast, Aina only seemed to shine brighter. Lionel had done the bulk of the work when it came to battling in the Rapak's nest, much to her dissatisfaction, so this was clearly one reason. But, the truth was that even if this wasn't the case, simply put, Aina's stamina was quite literally endless. And, even if she somehow ran into a wall, she could just snatch stamina from others. When you could tap into your life force and the life force of others whenever you pleased, physical limitations wasn't something you would ever face, at least not when you were in your right mind. The berserk state that Aina's previously faulty berserk god lineage factor sent her into was almost always the reason she spiraled out of control and overextended herself. Now that she was healed, that was nothing more than a problem of the past. If she needed to battle for months or even years without rest, she could do so. Lionel was forced into a corner, unable to dodge as a fist half the size of his body crashed right into his chest. Luckily, he managed to activate his bronze runes first, mitigating much of the damage. But this was just yet another stamina drain that he now had to sustain. Blood flew from his lips, his ribs threatening to crack as he was sent barreling away. Maybe the worst part of the situation was that the only reason his ribs had managed to survive was because his right arm was slung across his body, forcing it to take the brunt of the hit. The pain was like a fire lighting in his flesh and Lionel's mind threatened to go blank for a moment. If not for a timely use of dream sense, it might have really happened. He crashed against the ground, managing to use the momentum to spring up and flip to his feet, his heels still grinding into the ground as he slid backward. There was only one enormous ape left. He was certain that he had already shot well over the 10-minute mark, but he wasn't even aware of a leaderboard to begin with, so these matters were the furthest thing from his mind. I guess that's the only way. Lionel took deep breaths, wiping the blood from his mouth before his aura surged one more time. The images of an enormous red gold star appeared above his head. He pointed 2 fingers toward the sky, wild spear force forming and concentrating before shooting upward. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Visit Novelbin. Com, for the best no_vel_read_ng experience. The blue ape had entered a mad charge, barreling toward Lionel on all fours as it lumbered over. In that moment, the concentrated spear force began to swirl about the 3-meter-tall star, quickly forming the tip of a drill that spun faster and faster and faster. Lionel breathed heavily, pushing his universal force to its limits as the ape entered a 10-meter range. His fingers descended from the sky, pointing right at the charging ape. Die. The star shot forward, the golden drill before it acting as a vanguard as it tore through space, appearing before the charging ape in the blink of an eye. The ape rose to its hind legs, its chest expanding and the runes upon it glowing with a fierce light. It roared out, smashing 2 fists toward the rotating drill. Bang! 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 Sparks flew, a stalemate suddenly ensuing for just a moment. Until Lionel's spear force finally won out. Laced by his king's might, it tore into the runes of the ape, shredding them to pieces and eventually its entire body. Lionel collapsed to a single knee, his chest heaving, but the environment around him had already begun to shift. The world of black vanished, replaced by a resplendent white. A young man stood in the distance beneath a small tree, his delicate hand reaching up to lightly touch a golden apple. He seemed too handsome for words, as though he shouldn't belong in this world at all. This kid really has terrible luck. How long has it been since one of the spirituals' race has appeared in the Void Tower? Cornelius thought to himself. Important announcement below. Chapter 1406. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 39 seconds AM. Chapter 1406. Audioworth. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took deep breaths, observing the scene before him. He couldn't quite understand what was happening. Since nothing had been explained before, he had headed into this completely blind. He had no way of telling what he should be doing, if this was an enemy, if it was a break room, or if he should be worried or not. He had no way of communicating with Wise Star Order. Even his innate node which had been beneath his tongue couldn't be felt by him any longer, let alone any of his other treasures. If it wasn't for this, Lionel wouldn't have had nearly as many problems using his destruction runes. I guess since this is the 10th floor it was due for a bit of a change. They must treat this a lot like a video game with a boss every 10th floor. But why is this environment so different, and why hasn't this man attacked me yet? Despite his thoughts, Lionel took every second he had to regain his breath. He couldn't do much about the drained state of his mind, but he could at least try to let his healing factor kick in a bit to help with his physical fatigue. At the same time, he circulated his force through his nodes, allowing them to do the work they were meant to and quickly flood his body with oxygen. Lionel looked around. No needles, no daggers. I used up the last of my javelins on those apes. It seems that all I've got now is myself. Lionel stood. He didn't understand what was going on, but what he did know was that if this was an enemy, their patience wouldn't be nothing more than a detriment to him. He didn't believe that in such a trial, an enemy would be so nonchalant without cause or reason. This individual was definitely benefiting from his inaction somehow, or at the very least, this was the highest likelihood of what was otherwise a toss-up. Lionel liked to live his life based on probability, so knowing such a thing, he couldn't remain inactive. The moment he stood to his feet, though, the young man seemed to finally notice Lionel's presence. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. S is by N Uvelby, N. The moment their eyes met, Lionel took an explosive step backward, his pupils constricting and his heart nearly leaping out of his chest. Any fatigue he had seemed to be forgotten, allowing adrenaline to rush forward in its place. This is bad. Lionel didn't like his reaction just now at all. Adrenaline sounded nice, but the crash that came on the other side was very much real. It would have been better if he output what remaining stamina he had left in a steady stream rather than releasing it all in a sudden outburst. However, Lionel couldn't help it. Right then, his hairs had stood on end and his mind rang with blaring warning signs. He had quite literally felt as though his very soul was about to be pulled out of his body. The feeling was similar to when Wise Star Order had tricked him into reading the protected technique of the spirituals, except 100 times more potent. It was almost like a harpoon had latched onto him. Lionel had not a single clue just the kind of commotion his actions just now had caused. Let alone others. Cornelius finally stood stunned, unable to speak a single word. One of the most cursed objects of the Void Palace was the Void Tower. This was because so much of one's progress during a single run could be decided by good or bad luck, and definitely more especially the latter. There were a few things, though, that went beyond just bad luck. These chance events of the Void Tower were known by the students as drawing dead. It didn't matter what happened, how prepared you were, how good your run up until that point had been. So long as one of these events occurred, your run would be over. One of these so-called drawing dead events was the appearance of a spiritual as a boss. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novelbin.com to experience faster update speed. The only way to combat a spiritual in real life was to have a soul-protecting treasure on hand. The human domain never did battle with the spirituals without outfitting an entire army with them, and missions were never completed in spiritual territory on the void battlefield without them either. However, as one might have already guessed, it was impossible to bring treasures into the Void Tower, and the only weapons available in the armory you got to choose from were very simple weapons without any special effects whatsoever. So, what would you do in the face of a spiritual without a soul protection treasure? Well, what else could you do but wait to die? There was nothing else you could do. Some of the spear factions had already begun to feel sorry for Lionel. After all, even though he didn't know it, they knew well that so long as he cleared this 10th floor on his first run, he would become among the few in Void Palace history to ever be directly admitted as a galaxy-ranked disciple. However, running into a spiritual after having the bad luck of being given beast hordes to begin with. It could only be said that luck was truly not on Lionel's side. According to the usual pattern, so long as you remained unmoving, the spiritual would be too enamored by its precious tree to even bother with you. But, the moment you did, it would look at you and your mind would go blank. Game over. And yet, somehow, Lionel had risen up, moved, made eye contact, and still managed to explosively retreat, all without losing. How was that possible? Within the crowd, a particular young man stood in silence. His hair was bronzed, his eyes deep and somber. His stature was large and his shoulders were broad. His presence was sharp as a spear and as sturdy as a mountain. Even now, there was no shortage of looks of admiration and respect being aimed in his way. He was none other than the first Nova, Adaworth Morales. He smiled to himself seeing this scene. Then, he turned on his heels and walked into the distance. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1407. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 1407, Drawing Dead? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. At that moment, Aina exited the tower, followed a few moments later by Amory. Aina had climbed to the 12th floor before running into some bad luck of her own. Well, she had technically run into said bad luck on the 11th floor where she was faced with a skeleton graveyard. Without any blood force to take advantage of, strength at tier 2 of the 6th dimension, stacked with God path comprehension, was beyond what she could contend with. In order to cross the 11th floor, she essentially drained herself of all her life force, knowing that it was a simulation. But, facing even more undead on the 12th floor, there was really nothing that she could do to contend, leading to her loss. As for Amory, he climbed to the 10th, clearing it before he directly stopped. It was clear he knew things that Lionel and Aina didn't, so he hadn't even tried to go beyond. Stepping out, he rose his head to the leaderboards, giving them a once-over. When he saw that Lionel was still inside, and facing a spiritual at that, his gaze narrowed, an expression that only became darker when he realized that Lionel actually hadn't died. Aina's attention had been on Lionel from the very beginning. When she realized the race Lionel was up against, her brows, too, shot up. Beauty. Beauty. How about you join my Morning Dew faction? Well, give you a 100 void point daily spending quota and this big brother here will be your personal bodyguard. Fuck off, 100 void points? Are you trying to entice a beauty? Or call up a common street whore? Piss off. Beauty. My twin rope faction will give you a 10,000 void point monthly spending limit. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. S is BY Novelbin. The shouts instantly drowned out all the quiet, flooding the area with the bustling sounds of bids as though Aina was merchandise to be bought. No one bothered to try to entice Amory, knowing full well exactly who had joined. There was simply no point. However, Aina was a different matter entirely, and her performance had been simply outstanding. Shut up, all of you. An overwhelming pressure crushed the growing noise, the delicate voice that called out still somehow seeming like a clap of thunder. Most almost immediately shut their mouths, moving out of the way as a beauty sauntered over. They all recognized this woman quite well. There was no man of the Void Palace that wouldn't. Number 3 on the Queen Beauty rankings, Vega Aquarius. However, this identity of hers was most definitely the weakest, because she also happened to be the faction leader of the Limpid Touch faction. Not just any faction, but a gold-grade faction. The Limpid Touch faction was most definitely a frontrunner to soon become a legacy faction, as it was well known that Vega would soon meet the requirements to become the part of a party. As such, the current Limpid Touch faction was in a sort of contentious time as Vega waited to choose her successor and the soon-to-be second leader of the Limpid Touch faction. The trouble was that while the faction was filled with talents, none were so greatly superior over the other that there would be no pushback toward her choice. Knowing all of this, Vega's purpose here was all too obvious. Although Aina had only just appeared, the talent she displayed was unlike anything they had seen in a very long time. That, along with the fact she was a beauty that lost out to Vega in no way, made Aina quite literally the perfect candidate. Vega would have to slow her plans down a bit and push some things back so that she could groom Aina, but it would most definitely be worth it. It was like this present had fallen right into her lap. The prestige of a legacy faction was something she had wanted for a very long time. Only by making the Limpid Touch faction a legacy faction could it gain the foundation and strength to become a party. Once that happened, she could return as its leader, making her a party head with some real weight and authority. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. New novel chapters are published on Novelbin. Such a thing, though, couldn't be accomplished with just a single astounding talent. There were many talents in her faction, but the number on Vegas level was 0. If Aina was added, that number would tick up to 1. One pillar was shaky, but 2 pillars were a different matter entirely. Little sis, my name is Vega. If you join my Limpid Touch faction, I'm willing to give you 1,000,000 void point and 10 void merit allowance a month. We'll also give you a free pass to any of our stores and libraries. Also, Vegas' offers had already caused the crowd to suck in a cold breath. Many who had made offers previously could only blush in embarrassment, falling into hushed silence and scurrying into the crowd to escape from the jeers. However, Vega still came to a pause, realizing that Aina wasn't actually paying attention to her at all. Vega's cherry lips closed, her expression not faltering at all. She was truly worthy of her title of Queen Beauty. Her blue dress, embroidered by gorgeous green and gold patterns, clung to her every curve. Her hair was a radiant and almost fairy tale-like blue, her eyes shimmering a deep and vast emerald. Even being ignored, her expression was calm and her small hands clasped to her front, following Aina's gaze to the screen above. Ah. Aina looked back, seemingly feeling that someone was talking to her. I'm sorry, a moment please. Then, she turned back to the screen, focusing her entire attention on it. Vega had only rushed here after receiving a report from her subordinates and had only paid attention to Aina's screen from the very beginning. Her faction only had women in it to begin with, and she also didn't have time to spend on juniors. If not for the insistence of some of her faction, she wouldn't have come at all, and she was glad she had. But, now finally paying attention to Lionel's screen, her gaze couldn't help but narrow. Drawing dead? The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1408. Published at 21st of November 2022 9:46 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1408. Lake Prison if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel stood easily 50 meters away from the spiritual, his brows locked into a deep frown. Is this man a spiritual, then? Or is he a human with an ability to target souls? I don't think I've ever heard of the latter, but I've never seen Aina's ability index in a compendium either. It's possible that this is a uniquely evolved ability. I have seen those before and they can't be documented. Though Lionel thought this, he was more inclined to believe that this man before him was a spiritual. He looked simply too perfect. It reminded Lionel a lot of Wise Star Order's appearance. Souls tended to be extremely pure and more beautiful than the bodies they came from, according to Wise Star Order, anyway. This was because souls could be idealized thanks to their more intangible forms. In addition, a body had to undergo certain abuses a soul never would. For example, nutrition, injury, environment, all of these things could negatively affect the perfection of a body. The soul, though, was protected by its shell of flesh and thus avoided this. Of course, if this man was a spiritual, what Lionel was seeing right now wasn't a soul, but rather the body it had created for itself, a body which, likewise, wasn't subject to the same harsh realities of a human's body. Like Wise Star Order had said, spirituals formed their own bodies after their births. Being able to mold themselves in their own image like this would obviously give birth to the same sort of overdone perfection. Well, I guess my Aina is an exception. If others knew that Lionel had wasted a thought for such a clarification, who knew how they would react? Now that Lionel had calmed, though, he noticed several things. Well, several things outside the fact he was even more tired now than before. The first was that this spiritual wasn't in the 6th dimension at all, they were in the 5th. Lionel had a feeling that if his soul was still in the 5th as well, that attack just now would have most definitely killed him. The gap in skill was almost too much even for the dimensional gap to overcome. The second was that this man seemed to now be frowning a bit, almost as though he was surprised that Lionel was still standing. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. S is by N. Uvelby, N. The third was the tree and especially the golden apple. Lionel hadn't really thought about it before, but why was it here? Was there something important about it? It was then that he felt a subtle sort of connection between the man and it. But, almost as soon as he did, it was as though his internal sight had rammed into a steel wall, being rebuffed and knocked flying. Lionel almost subconsciously fell backward, only to realize it was only his mind that had been sent soaring. Lionel retrieved his internal sight, reining it in and sending it forward again, only for the result to be just the same. And then he tried again, then again. Lionel's gaze narrowed, stepping forward, slowly. He closed the distance between himself and the young man. The rebuffing became more and more powerful, but every time it happened, Lionel seemed to get better at handling it. Do it again. Lionel thought silently to himself. What he spoke about wasn't the internal sight sparring at all. He meant something entirely different. Lionel eventually stepped to the very spot he had been in before when he explosively retreated, and that was when he felt it. No, this time, with his internal sight deployed, he could almost see it. It speared through the air, appearing before his forehead in the blink of an eye. It was so fast that it was almost impossible to dodge. Almost. Lionel's head tilted to the side, but he was still a step too late. The harpoon threaded into the side of his forehead, snagging at a piece of his soul and trying to rip it out. For just a moment, Lionel didn't fight back against the sensation, feeling it pulling at him. The feeling was much less life-threatening than it had been before, but he could feel that if he allowed it to happen, his mind would be irreparably harmed. This wasn't the kind of injury you could heal. Lionel was certain wouldn't have even the slightest effect. However, this was just a simulation. Lionel felt that if there was any place he could toe the line like this, it was in this place. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Visit Novelbin. Com, for the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Just when Lionel felt like his soul was truly about to be ripped out, his will flourished, his dream force pulling back and his stars began to rotate faster. The weak hold the harpoon had had on him weakened even further, snapping and releasing Lionel. However, at that moment, Lionel's partially awakened soul seemed to have perked up more. Again. Lionel said, taking another step forward. The spiritual didn't need Lionel's input, he had already attacked again the moment Lionel moved. Lionel's head shifted again, but this time, he purposely let himself get nicked. Lionel repeated the process again and again. Slowly, from somewhere deep within the recesses of Lionel's body, his soul was slowly being dragged out from its slumber. With each attempt, Lionel's dream force seemed to become thicker, his affinity deepening and his ability index trembling, creeping forward at a slow, but steady pace. In an odd, unknown world, a version of Lionel stood. Its arms dangled forward limply, its legs pinned down to the ground and its head drooping, its expression impossible to spot. All around it, a dense lake of crimson lay, its hands and feet bound within. Black chains wrapped around it entirely, shackling its neck, its torso, and its hips. However, the greatest anchor seemed to be the lake of red itself. What very much seemed to be a pool of blood. Every time the harpoon nicked Lionel, it would stir, its head raising slightly. By the time Lionel had closed the distance to the spiritual to just 10 meters, its head had risen just high enough to see a pair of eyes just barely cracking open. A chain snapped, the blood lake suddenly beginning to boil. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1409. Published at 23rd of November 2022 7:34 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1409. Flood. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Sorry to everyone who saw the earlier 2-day hiatus message. I guess I lied. Lionel's body convulsed, the white of his eyes being taken over by a deep red. Despite this, he felt oddly in control of his body, so much so that it was almost as though adrenaline had been injected right into his heart. Even still, he couldn't feel the needle. Something snapped and his dream force rolled out in waves, the strength of his internal sight increasing tenfold and his ability index taking another enormous leap forward. The world slowed and the complex runes of his Scarlet Star force almost felt simple. His internal sight only swept over it just a single time, but his number of comprehended runes increased from 8 to 9 in the blink of an eye. At that moment, the red-gold runes snapped together as though pulled by a rubber band, forming a larger rune that danced within Lionel's irises as though it had a mind of its own. Lionel didn't even need to check. In that moment, he was absolutely certain that he had perfectly grasped third-dimensional Scarlet Star Force. So long as he wanted to do so, using his mage core, he could rip it out of the atmosphere just like his stars had done. Of course, this didn't mean that these runes were third-dimensional. Even for Scarlet Star Force, using the third dimension to harm the sixth dimension was impossible. If this had been the case, then the use of his runes against the Rapax would have only been a lesson in futility. Rather, it was more accurate to say that grasping these destruction runes gave Lionel all the knowledge he needed to understand the foundation of his Scarlet Star Force and thus use its third-dimensional form without harming himself or using an innate node as a medium. However, this wasn't what Lionel was focused on at all. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. SS Novel, B, in. XSS. His mind seemed to be boiling, spilling over with strength that seemed to come out of nowhere. It was almost too much, as though he was suddenly being overwhelmed with strength that he had no method of controlling. It spilled over, rushing out of his body and into the surroundings. The sudden change made Lionel's expression change. He had never been able to force his dream force out of his body before, it had never allowed him to do so. Everything he did with dream force was constrained within his body. Even when he drew mage arts using dream force, the process was internal, and yet had an effect on the outside world, similar to how internal sight functioned. There was a reason internal sight had its name. Although it could be used to observe the outside world, its roots were internal, and its external influence was a sort of force field of sorts and not truly tangible, at least not in the most obvious of ways. What the hell? Lionel was so focused on himself that he didn't even notice the spiritual sent forward another harpoon. But, before it could even get close, it became stuck in a swamp of dream force, before being crushed and twisted as though it had suddenly run into a heavy gravitational environment it didn't have the structural integrity to survive. The spiritual's brows furrowed, its gaze flickering with a hint of fear and apprehension. It wanted to retreat, feeling that Lionel was a danger, but every time it thought of doing so, it looked toward its tree and then back at Lionel, before turning back to the tree. The truth was that spirituals paid a price for their oneness with nature. Well, from a human perspective, it was a price. To a spiritual, at least the one in question, it was a beautiful thing. To wider spiritual society, though, it was a curse and a mental illness. Just as easily as a spiritual could fall in love with another member of their species, it was just as likely for them to fall in love with a beast or in this case, a tree. Things wouldn't be so bad if the target of their affection could move, but in this case it couldn't. Well, the spiritual might refuse to move from a singular location all their lives. In practice, this was actually quite rare. Most spirituals would never end up feeling this sort of connection, and still some others, even upon feeling it, would choose to sever it entirely to maintain their freedom. However, the trouble was that in taking the latter approach, said spiritual would lose much of their oneness with nature and thus their affinity upon making such a choice. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. The source of this content is Novelbin. Likely in order to make this boss fight more fair, the spawned spiritual was anchored to a tree it was in love with. It was almost like an Easter egg, an opportunity for easy victory. So long as the tree was destroyed, the spiritual would fall into despair and likely kill themselves, thus resulting in victory. Unfortunately, things almost never worked out in this way. A soul attack was far faster than any physical attack. The only reason Lionel could even begin to dodge was because he sensed it coming before it was levied. It was impossible to destroy the tree before the spiritual killed you. But, in this case, Lionel's dream force continued to roll out of him, refusing to listen to any of his commands. The spiritual stood before his tree to protect it, unwilling for any harm to come to it. But, Lionel's dream force continued, coming out in wave after wave. When the dream force made contact with the spiritual, nothing seemed to happen at all. But, the spiritual's eyes still widened. Lionel's dream force was like a thick oil, latching onto his skin and blocking all of his pores. Even when the spiritual tried to project his soul out again to attack Lionel and stop this madness, he found that his soul rebounded against its skin, being locked into his body. Lionel continued to stand in silence, his mind still clear as he focused on trying to take control of himself again. He couldn't decide whether what was happening was a good or bad thing. What was happening to him, exactly? Chapter 1410. Published at 23rd of November 2022 7:34 and 52 seconds AM. Chapter 1410, So what? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. It was odd. Dream force was meant to be one of the most dangerous forces in all of existence. As the arbiter of consciousness, having it in too large a supply was always a bad thing, as those who didn't have high affinity for it would find the line between fiction and reality blurred, a lot like what a schizophrenic would experience. Dream force carried with it the power of perception, and fundamentally, perception was often reality. If someone had a dream about being invincible, they would wake up and this feeling would be gone. In addition, they would then be able to pick out all the oddities in the dream that should have made it obvious to them that it was one. However, if the dream force was cranked up, suddenly the line wouldn't be so obvious. The dream would become too real, too tangible. Then, you'd suddenly have a person jumping out of a building as a mere mortal in the real world because they got it in their heads that they were invincible. The effects went beyond dreams as well. Just things as simple as thoughts, inclinations, biases, etc., could easily become too real to ignore. Suddenly, an opinion would become objective fact, a daydream would be reality, a hope would become certainty. Believe it or not, these would be the most benign effects of excessive dream force. Beyond this, one might sink into a forever coma, believing their dreams to be the new reality. And, in the worst of cases, one's mind could collapse, forgetting how to function correctly and thus leading to the most direct cause of death. Playing with consciousness was dangerous. Almost like playing with layers of irony. Eventually, if you went deep enough, you would lose the ability to tell where the joke started and where it ended. However, somehow, despite all these dangers, the spiritual was fine. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com. To experience faster update speed, visit Novelbin. Com. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, it was like Lionel's dream force was in a benign state. Despite being able to come out of his body now, he still wasn't able to use it to attack people or harm them. Lionel had known that his ability limited him in this way for a long time. In fact, even Lionel, who had reached Tier 5 and could project his dream force outward, couldn't use it to harm others directly either. He could only mold his dream force to shape reality and use said changes to attack his enemies. However, Lionel couldn't do that. Not to mention the fact he was fairly certain he hadn't been born a savant due to the existence of his lineage factors and his innate node. Right this moment, he still couldn't even begin to control this dream force. How was he supposed to manipulate reality if he couldn't even stop it from flowing outward? I need to change my approach, do something different. Lionel began to make a scan of his body, going through every vital sign and checking for any stages. But, before he could even get halfway through the analysis, he froze. Whenever Lionel wanted to do in-depth analysis, he would always enter his dream world. Everything flowed faster there and he was in control of every single variable. His models were vivid, his mind seemed to work at twice the pace, and it was easy to visualize everything. But, never had his thoughts appeared in the real world like this. Lionel stood, stunned, a perfect replica of himself standing right in front of him. It was illusory and its skin was quite blue, but Lionel could see it, not with his mind's eye, but with his real eyes. His dream clone, it was standing right in front of him. What the hell? Lionel lost focus, causing the dream clone to waver and almost completely collapse. No. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Visit Novelbin. Com. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel settled his mind, and the dream clone stabilized again. It felt as though he was looking right at a hologram, as real and tangible as such a thing could get. He stretched out a hand, but his hand passed right through it, just like it would in his dream world. Lionel was baffled. His expression kept changing, trying to understand what this sort of change meant. Had his ability index evolved? Could he make illusions now? Warp reality? No, that didn't seem to be the case. Even when he tried to make himself more tangible than just a blue hologram, it didn't go very far. Even a toddler wouldn't be fooled by this image. In addition, if he couldn't even make an illusion, warping reality was an even further away pipe dream. This was very clearly something else entirely. If he had to describe it, it was like his dream world had suddenly manifested into reality. He could do everything he had been able to do in there, or here now. But, so what? Lionel couldn't think of what use such an ability could have. If he really applied it, he could probably become one of the greatest teachers or professors to ever exist, and he would be pretty good at relaying his thoughts precisely and with ease. But, all of this felt a bit hollow. Maybe there was something more? Something greater on the other side? If only he could just retract his dream force, so long as he could do that, he could try to get the spiritual to work with him again, pulling out more of his soul. Lionel was certain that the result of this change was related to the changes to his soul, so he just had to try to replicate it to the best of his abilities. What Lionel didn't know, though, was that he had been frozen in place ever since those chains snapped. Everything that he had imagined himself and his environment doing, from the movement of the spiritual, to the flood of his dream force, to the appearance of his dream clone, and even down to the movement of his hand through its hologram, had never happened at all. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1411. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1411. Perfectly if audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Despite the fact he had concluded that the ability was useless, Lionel was still fascinated by the feeling. There was something especially immersive about having all of his ideas and thoughts floating around him. It made it all more real, more tangible. Although Lionel had always been able to sink into his dream world whenever he wanted, the disconnect between it and reality was such that he was always keenly aware of his real Buddhist place in the world. Because of that, he could never fully enjoy himself. As such, he had always kept his dream world to the bare minimum. White walls, pale and transparent dream clones, even his dreamscape was nothing more than a skeleton of ideas, like jotted down notes only he could understand. When things were like this, though, Lionel felt more licensed to have fun. The world became overlapped with the vastness of space. His dreamscape became like constellations in the skies, its ideas connecting to form fantastical images and gorgeous picturesque scenes of legends gone by. His thoughts became organized into planets and their ecosystems, the trees carrying his thoughts, the waters carrying his streams of consciousness, the clouds becoming as fleeting and numerous as his daydreams. Lionel smiled. He didn't know why he hadn't done this before. Like this, everything seemed so much more beautiful. It connected in a way that surpassed what it had been capable of before, making his cold calculation feel a lot less like work and more like the masterful strokes of an artisan. Lionel became so lost in it all that his concept of time warped. It was only when he finally snapped out of it that his expression changed. How long had it been since he paid attention to what the spiritual had been doing? Just because the spiritual had powerful soul attacks, that didn't mean it was all they were capable of. They could just as easily attack with their bodies, or even make use of another one of their powerful abilities, elemental manipulation. Lionel's eyes snapped open, trying to find the spiritual. Wait, weren't his eyes already open? Hadn't he been observing his dream world being projected onto the real world? Isn't that why he was so confident in losing focus a bit to begin with? After all, if his soul was useless, the spiritual couldn't do much that Lionel wouldn't be able to react to. After all, the both of them were in the fifth dimension. If the former had to attack physically, Lionel was sure that he could at least do something about it. But if his eyes had always been open, why did he suddenly open them? Wait, if he had opened his eyes, then why was he still seeing the same thing? Lionel's gaze turned cold. He should have known this would happen. His dream force couldn't affect others, but it could definitely affect him. That was the main purpose of his ability index to begin with and precisely why Tier 4 was called Control. The fact that he couldn't control the outflow of his dream force should have already told him that it had surpassed the barriers that his affinity could control. However, he had actually been slow in realizing such a simple fact. The situation wasn't entirely bad, though. When others were lost in dream force, the most dangerous part was that they would become unaware. The fact that he knew that something was wrong already proved that he was beyond most people. The trouble was, even knowing he was trapped, he still couldn't separate dreams from reality. He couldn't even tell whether his eyes were open or not. There's something else here, something that he needed to deal with before he could find his way out. The situation outside seemed to only be getting odder. Lionel hadn't moved in several minutes, but the trouble was, neither did the spiritual. And it was then that it happened. This sent waves through the crowd, but the picture above was still frozen in place. Could it be that there had been a glitch in the Void Tower system and Lionel was actually just fine? Aina sighed a breath of relief. She had been worried that the run-in with the spiritual had affected Lionel's real body. Her worries weren't unfounded. The reason why the spiritual was in the fifth dimension despite the fact that Lionel had already stepped into sixth-dimensional floors was because the elders of the Void Palace were worried that the shock would be too much otherwise. So long as it was just a simple image glitch, she could accept this. Now, she just had to wait patiently for Lionel to come out. However, what happened next was somehow even more astonishing than a first clear event. Heavy gravity, first attempt, all-time Nov LB, in. Hadn't Lionel just been tired? He had already been on his last legs, on the verge of collapsing. How did he clear the 11th floor? And setting a record that beat the previous by more than a minute? The crowd didn't know what to say. Cornelius didn't know what to say. It felt like they were the ones stuck in a dream, unable to extricate themselves. Floor 50. Floor 50. Floor 50 was where the seventh dimension began. The doors of the tower opened on the dawn of the third day. A young man stumbled forward, but he lacked the strength to do much of anything. He tripped, his body falling forward. However, before he could hit the ground, a rush of fragrant wind assaulted him and swept him into a soft embrace. The young man didn't say a word, collapsing, his light snores ringing out just moments later. Aina held on to Lionel, her brows furrowed. Tears of blood ran down his face and caked his scalp, giving his hair a dark, redder hue than it usually did. His fingers dripped with blood. Slung over her shoulders, she could still hear the pitter-patter as they hit the hard ground. His chest was practically a gaping cavity, his ribs torn open and his beating heart thrumming for the world to hear as pulsing golden runes laced around it. None of this made any sense. The Void Tower was a simulation and nothing more. Your real body never entered. How could it leave Lionel's body in such a state? What had happened to him? However, maybe the most shocking part was that his right arm was out of its sling. Somehow perfectly healed. Chapter 1412. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1412, L. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Aina brought out her axe, allowing it to hover in the air so that she could lay Lionel across its large blades. Although she could carry Lionel herself, because he was so much larger than her, she was worried about injuring him further than he already was by forcing him into an awkward position. As things stood, this was the best option. Aina turned back, somewhat frantically, feeling that Lionel's breath was far too weak and it seemed to only be getting weaker. She didn't understand how things had ended up like this, but it simply didn't matter until Lionel was at least stabilized first. Do you know where I can get him help? Vega had ended up staying here the entire time. But, the more she saw how attached to Lionel Aina already was, the more she felt that her dreams of claiming Aina for herself were slipping away further. At least not by any ethical means. Treatment isn't free. Vega replied. She wasn't wrong. Nothing in the Void Palace was free. There was a reason why the envoys sent to oversee the selection on planet Luxnix had been so eager. That time they spent, despite it technically being for work, was basically a vacation for them. The Void Palace was practically hell on earth for its students. There was nothing that didn't cost, and no small number of promising young talents had fallen because they couldn't afford medical treatment. Of course, the most talented of these promising youths usually had other backers to rely on. But, for Aina and Lionel, who had only just arrived, despite their talent, this spelled trouble. If an organization wanted to take advantage of their current weakness at this moment, it would almost be too easy. Luckily, there was a silver lining, and that would be competition. With their talent, it was likely that many would want them. Although no one understood what had happened to Lionel, they had at least watched his performance on the first 9 floors, and that much was enough. The trouble was, how many dared to compete with a gold-grade faction? And not just any gold-grade faction at that, but one on the verge of becoming a legacy faction. Aina's brows furrowed, clearly understanding this. Aren't there rewards for breaking records? She asked through gritted teeth. Vega's gaze shifted upward, looking at the long line of leaderboards that surrounded the tower. By now, Lionel's name appeared much too many times for comfort. The crowd had considerably thinned in recent days, but the intrigue around what was happening hadn't lessened in the slightest. Whether or not these records will hold up is one matter. However, even if the Senate decides to keep things as is, leaderboard rewards are calculated by the month, and we happen to be right in the middle of one, with the next turn being a little more than 2 weeks away. Vega looked back. Why would they do that? You might be ignorant to what the 74th floor means, but others are not. I, myself, have only managed to climb to the 48th floor. Of course, that's also because I have not entered the tower in years, as I've been focused on other things, but I can still guarantee that the me of back then shouldn't need to lift a finger to defeat someone within the 5th dimension. As for those who have climbed to the 74th floor, they're all in the Senate, seventh-dimensional powerhouses who dictate how things run here. Do you think they'll believe that someone of the fifth dimension was able to accomplish this? And on top of that, he's heavily injured, something that shouldn't be possible in the tower. It's obvious that something has gone wrong. If you're lucky, he'll be allowed a redo. However, considering what his father just did to the majority leader, I wouldn't bank on it. Aina's brows furrowed. His father? Obviously, she had no idea what had happened. But this matter had been the talk of the Void Palace until Lionel's matter seemed to have taken over. Unfortunately, it was exactly because of this that there was even less of a chance Lionel could get away with it. The Void Senate was definitely in the know, and the unfettered Blade Party held all the power right now. It was already a dark enough time for spearmen in the Void Palace. As for Lionel, well, it didn't take a genius to understand that it might very well be worse. Vega didn't explain, instead choosing to talk about something else entirely. I won't take advantage of you, but I also won't help you for free. I have no obligation to. It's simple really, all you have to do is join my faction. The benefits I listed before will be the same, and I can also guarantee that once I enter the Void Senate, you will take my place and control the faction. N0VL next. Koamena's brows furrowed deeper. She didn't want to leave Lionel's side, she hadn't gotten to spend nearly enough time with him, and they had already been apart for over a year. She had been a part of the Void Palace long enough to know even if they were in the same organization, they might be worlds apart. The rules were strict and the room to maneuver was minimal. If she joined a faction, especially an ambitious one like this one, they would probably run her ragged for the sake of the group. That didn't even mention the trouble that would come with joining such a hot pot. There would definitely be waves of internal struggle. But she had already left Lionel alone for too long. His injuries were far too severe, and if he could have healed them, he would have already done so. This wouldn't work at all. She had to. Aina bit her lip, ready to accept. But, before she could, a voice came over. What's this? Trying to exploit my sister-in-law in her most vulnerable state? You're quite shameless, third Queen Beauty. A chuckle came from the distance as a bronze-haired young man appeared. He was quite sloppily dressed, but the brightness of his eyes was undeniable. It gave him a sort of charisma most lacked. He was the fourth Nova, Sio. Chapter 1413. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 44 seconds AM. Chapter 1413. Underest if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Sio was the very same Nova Oren and Zavnik had spoken about during their earlier conversations. He had gotten into the stalwart polearm party a step later than first Nova, leaving him fighting for its scraps. But, despite his supposedly desperate situation, one definitely couldn't tell by his demeanor that anything was wrong. His robes were in disorder, his hair was messy, but he still looked well rested and sharp. If anything, he was just too lazy to groom himself any better than he already had. Vega's eyes narrowed, looking back towards Sio with a sharp look. AI, don't look at me like that, I scare easily. Are you interfering with my business? Have you forgotten the lesson I taught you last time? Vega's gaze turned dangerous, her hair rippling about. She had already wasted several days here and she was close to getting what she wanted. But now it felt like someone was snatching food she was just about to bite down on away. Sio sighed and shook his head. These are simply the lumps a romantic like me must take in pursuing love. I dared to bare my heart and I suffered for it. As a man, I can only respect your decision and move on, but why must you dig up my scars like so? Vega lost her patience, suddenly striking out with a palm. Sio didn't have a chance at all to dodge, facing the full brunt of it crashing into his chest. Clang! Oof! Sio stumbled several steps backward, coughing. Bronze runes flickered across his body. It was clear that while he had been slow to react in action, his runes still activated on instinct. Sio beat a fist against his chest, wheezing a bit. Good hit. Definitely solid. 8 out of 10. He raised up a thumb, giving Vega a sign for a job well done. It wasn't very surprising that Vega was actually much stronger than Sio. The trouble was that Sio was a bit shameless. Sio took Velasco as his idol, and his romantic life reflected that. He had already snagged several women from Vega's faction, and yet still somehow had the audacity to chase after Vega herself. It could be said that his face was quite thick. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Normally, Vega wouldn't care about this. Her faction might have been female only, but she didn't monitor their relationship so long as it didn't interfere with their duties. The trouble was, this time it did. In fact, it could be said that about 20% of the strain of her faction currently was caused by this man here. Sio had managed to woo 2 of her 7 Valkyries. And they also happened to be 2 of the 3 or 4 most likely to succeed her. When they found out that they had both been with the same man, they became like oil and water. If they were both somehow on fire. Vega had managed to suppress much of these issues, and Aina felt like the perfect remedy to deal with this matter once and for all, but then this bastard actually dared to appear before her again. Sio coughed again, finally straightening up. Still, even if you're mad third queen beauty, I still have my duties as a big brother to fulfill. Vega's expression twisted with disgust. Knowing Sio, it would be a miracle if Lionel was left with his underpants after all of this was through. Still, she turned on her heels and began to walk away without so much as a goodbye to anyone present. She had wasted enough time here, and the one rule that everyone had to follow in the Void Palace was no killing. Even if she beat Sio to a pulp, it wouldn't help her mood out. In fact, he would only take greater pleasure in ruining her plans. Sio grinned wildly, his eyes practically glued to Vega's swaying bottom as she glided into the distance. Damn, that woman's really like water. Even her palm felt good. I really need to have me a taste. Aina's brows furrowed listening to Sio's vulgarity. She suddenly wasn't very certain if this was a good turn of events or not. Sio turned back, his eyes lighting up when he saw Aina's face. He had already known that this sister-in-law of his was beautiful, but to think she really lost out to the likes of Vega in no way. TSK, littlest Nova sure was lucky to have snagged something like this before stepping foot into the Void Palace. Where was the justice? This gaze, though, only made Aina's frown deepen. If not for the fact Sio had already become her last hope, she would have long since turned and left. Sio chuckled. No need to act like this. I'm greedy and lustful, but I never touch the women of my brothers. However, I will take their money. I'll pay for littlest Nova's treatment. But the interest? Well, let's just say that the interest won't be small. Sio grinned, his smile both devilishly handsome and demonic. Many dispersed and left the traffic around the Void Tower about normal for what it usually would be. However, the mystery around what exactly had happened felt heavier and deeper than many knew or were even willing to think about. Most assumed that the Void Senate would soon find out what happened and report these matters. But, the oddity was that, this chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. The Void Tower was still open, functioning as though nothing at all had happened. Still, despite this, what was maybe even more shocking was that the Void Elders themselves were also baffled by exactly what had occurred as well. They stood in the air, unbeknownst to anyone, cloaked in black. You all sense it, right? Yes. This dream force, it leaked out from the inside. Nov LB, in. COM, you mean? For several days, we didn't dare to approach this place, we could only let things play out as they would. But, it seems that this dream force didn't have any malicious intent. Maybe. But it also distorted reality to the point none of us know what happened inside. The cloaked figures fell into silence, their gazes turning toward Cornelius, who was still frozen in the air, unmoving. Cornelius might have an inkling of what happened as he was in range. Yes, but he's currently stuck in a dream loop. It will take him several months to pull himself out. Time might also not be the only price he pays. This isn't a normal application of dream force, it feels almost like a soul attack, like those under its influence were pulled in rather than the world around them distorting like usual. Another silence fell. What did Velasco do to this child? Someone finally asked. I don't know if even the likes of Velasco can do this. But what I do know is that this child is even more trouble than his father. So, those of you who've been colluding to stab the human race in its back, I hope you glide on the tips of your toes a bit lighter. Nov LB, in. Velasco's line seems intent on revenge. No one spoke a word as they gazed back and forth between one another. They had known that there were traitors among them for a very long time, but it was impossible to weed out exactly who it was. In recent decades, after Velasco had come into his own strength, the movements had only become more subtle and harder to detect. But this Leonel Morales seemed to be another wild variable thrown into the fuel. Chapter 1414. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 1414. Twice if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Leonel shot up, his body covered in cold sweats as he breathed heavily. When a normal person hyperventilated, maybe the worst thing that would happen was lighthead and some noise. However, when someone like Leonel did so, it was like the entire room had become infused with a raging tornado. Winds whipped into the surroundings, crashing against the walls and sending whatever was light enough to not remain anchored down spiraling into the surroundings. It took Leonel several moments before he realized he was no longer stuck, but the fear made his heart thrum. He couldn't be sure, was this really the real world? Leonel looked down, finding Aina sleeping soundly on his lap. Even through all the commotion, she remained in a deep sleep. She sat in a chair by Leonel's side, leaning forward to rest her cheek on him. There was definitely more than enough room in bed for her to sleep by his side, but she must have been worried about him not healing properly. Seeing her sleeping so peacefully helped Leonel's heart rate to calm considerably. Bit by bit, his heavy breathing slowed and returned to a normal cadence. N0VL next. Koam, what happened to me? Leonel's brows furrowed. He subconsciously checked over his body, but what he found was even more difficult to accept than anything he had put the crowd observing him through. It was so baffling that he almost couldn't accept it. Had he been in a coma for years? It was the only way he could explain what he was seeing. No, that didn't make sense. With years, considering Aina's talent, she would have most definitely progressed into the 6th dimension. There was no way she would still be at the 5th. Leonel had no one he could ask except Wise Star Order. He almost felt stupid doing so, knowing full well that the old man shouldn't have been able to see what was going on in the tower. But something compelled him to do so anyway, feeling that he had nowhere else to turn to. Old man? What the hell happened to me? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Leonel's question was met by a long silence. At first, he thought the old man was taking his time to respond, something that happens sometimes. But, as the seconds ticked by, Leonel felt that there was something wrong. Where were the snide remarks? The sarcastic comebacks? The rain of insults? Leonel sent his mind into the segmented cube and what he saw left him frozen. There was nothing. An empty, vast, nothingness. No, this wasn't entirely true. In the place of what should have been Leonel's greatest reliances, there was an odd swirling portal and fragments of space. The only time he had ever seen something like this was when he entered subdimensional zones, but there was very clearly no zone magically hiding within his segmented cube. Realizing what this could mean, Leonel's expression went ashen. He rarely reacted like this to any change. In fact, he could ever remember reacting like this to anything. However, if he was correct, this sort of event warranted exactly this kind of shock and horror. The segmented cube was ultimately a powerful spatial tool. If the inside of it looks like this, then the only explanation was that the inner space of the segmented cube collapsed, taking with it everything that had been within. The bronze and silver tablet, the cleansing waters, the tentacle womb, Wise Star Order, the 2 savants, and Little Black Star. Novel Bin. Leonel's heart seized, his jaw clenching tight. He didn't want to believe it, but he didn't have any other explanation. The resources, he could accept the loss of. He had no idea what happened, but things were ultimately things. He could even accept the loss of Y's star order. Though the old man had been useful, Lionel had already lost count of the number of times he had tried to kill him. Even the tentacle womb and the golden-scaled koi fish, he could get over it. However, Little Black Star, Candle and Vice. That he could not accept. Lionel's gaze flashed with red, his teeth clenching so hard the blood dripped down from their crevices. What happened? What happened? What happened to him? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net Lionel balled his fists, trying to calm himself down, but he found it hard to do so. There had to be a way to reverse this, a way to turn it back around. The segmented cube was the heirloom of the Morales family. How could it possibly collapse so easily? How could something like this happen? No, there has to be a way. I don't believe it. Lionel wouldn't accept that this could just happen. Little Black Star had been injured, but Lionel had always been keeping up with him. Thanks to Lionel killing the Shadow Sovereign, the little guy had been able to absorb another shadow world into himself, strengthening him and helping him to heal faster. By the time Lionel had entered the Void Tower, Little Black Star had already recovered to easily 90% and was prepared to surpass his former self. This was all to say that given his abilities, the one most likely to survive the collapse of a spatial device was most definitely the little mink. It was impossible for Little Black Star to just sit there and wait for death. Even if the little guy couldn't save everything, he could most definitely save himself. Wait, connection? Lionel placed a hand to his chest. If Little Black Star had died, their connection would have definitely been severed. Even though Lionel couldn't feel Little Black Star right now, he knew that their connection was still intact. This thought helped Lionel to relax slightly, but it still wasn't enough for him to settle down all his worries. There has to be a way, but I won't find it by panicking. I need to find out what happened in these last few days, and to do that, I'll need to first understand the changes to my body. Maybe then I can get an inkling as to why the change was so drastic. The change wasn't just a little drastic, actually. The main reason Lionel had been shocked was because the snowy star owl lineage factor wasn't within him any longer. It had evolved. Twice. Chapter 14-15. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 41 seconds AM. Chapter 14-15, Awakenings. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again somehow. Without his control or consent, Lionel's snowy star owl lineage factor had become the starry-tailed fox lineage factor. Not only that, but it had completed all of its awakening completely. Just the base strength Lionel's body right now was beyond anything he had ever felt before. It was as thought his body had been injected with steroids. The starry-tailed fox had 3 branches as well. The speed branch, the healing branch, and the wisdom spirit branch. Y's star order had never been able to explain to Lionel exactly what wisdom spirit branch meant, but experiencing it now, Lionel felt like he was almost walking on clouds. To the snowy star owl, the wisdom branch was simple. It only represented the mind and its dimension, in addition to the senses. Each awakening either increased the strength of the mind or the eyes. In combination, they became the greatest embodiment of the snowy star owl's sensory capabilities. The wisdom spirit branch, though, went beyond just senses. Or, at least it went beyond senses in just its normal and rawest form. It also happened to extend to senses of the spirit, or in other words, the very same sort of oneness with their surroundings that spirituals felt. If Lionel was any other person rising to the 4th awakening of the wisdom spirit branch, his light and star elemental affinity would skyrocket to realms beyond words. He would gain the ability to control atmospheric light and star elemental forces as though he was breathing, and he would also find that increasing his strength through the use of light and star elemental forces had become vastly easier. These benefits didn't bother to mention other miscellaneous matters such as better control over the light and star elements as well, along with many other related matters. Unfortunately, a 7th dimensional lineage factor, even one that sat at the pinnacle of the world, wasn't enough to grant Lionel any of these benefits because, quite frankly, he already had them. The starry-tailed fox wasn't strong enough to outclass an innate node like Lionel's, especially not when it was so outrageously large to begin with. However, this didn't mean that Lionel had gained nothing from the 4 awakenings. Firstly, his mind had climbed to the pinnacle of the 6th dimension. It would have entered the 7th, however his Buddhist limitations had stopped it from growing any further. Even with all of said limitations, Lionel's split minds could only be counted on orders of hundreds of millions now. Secondly, and maybe Lionel's favorite benefit, Lionel could use light and star elemental force to replenish his tired mind. He didn't have to sleep if he didn't want to, but this wouldn't be what Lionel used it for. Instead, he was more interested in the fact that the state of fatigue his mind had reached before would be much harder for him to hit now, even if he was using his destruction runes. The third benefit was related to the 3rd and 4th awakenings of the wisdom branch. The first 2 awakenings elevated Lionel's mind to what should have been the pinnacle of the 7th dimension and gave him the gaze of the starry-tailed fox. The latter worked similarly to the snowy star owl's eyes, but was much more potent and even carried with it a dazing sort of effect that was similar to how Lionel's king's might worked. The 3rd and 4th awakenings, though, were related to the namesake of the starry-tailed fox. Their tails. Upon entering a battle state, long, large and illusory white tails would appear to Lionel's back. Each tail was like a powerful black hole, pulling in the exact sort of force it wanted and forming a domain with it. The starry-tailed fox had 3 tails. The tail of light, the tail of stars, and the tail of spirit. With them, Lionel could form a starry light domain, a starry star domain and a starry spirit domain. From what Lionel could tell, the starry light domain was both defensive and evasive, working in tandem with the speed branch. The starry star domain was defensive and worked well to control a battlefield, especially if there were many enemies. The starry spirit domain was a sensory domain that elevated beyond internal sight. In addition, it also worked similarly to a spiritual medium, forming the illusory tail as its core. There were many things Lionel could think of using it for if he combined its effects with his mage core. The healing branch raised what Lionel had experienced with the snowy star owl to a completely different level. The first awakening granted his instantaneous recovery once again, but the potency was beyond imagining. Lionel had a feeling that this had to be what had healed his right hand even though he couldn't remember using it. The second awakening granted him his passive healing factor, something that when stacked with a fully awakened wisdom spirit branch would hardly allow him to get nicked without instantly healing. Though, this reality only made the fact that he had been so heavily injured to begin with even more baffling. The third awakening granted him access to the starry-tailed fox's bestial transformation. Though he had never seen it, he could probably guess what it would look like. N0VL next. Koem finally, the fourth awakening amplified everything to its extreme, allowing him the ability to, once again, use instantaneous recovery once a day. As for the final speed branch, Lionel had grown numb enough to not continuously feel shock, but he could already feel that his speed was mind-numbing. The final awakening of the speed branch when fused with the starry light domain practically gave Lionel instantaneous teleportation abilities. Matched with his mind, so long as his stamina kept up, Lionel truly couldn't see how anyone below the sixth dimension could last a few rounds against him. Well, maybe aside from this masochist girlfriend of his. After going through all of this, Lionel managed to calm his heart a bit. But, as fast as his mind was now, it was only a matter of time before he stumbled into a new problem. One heirloom seemed to be completely ruined. So what about this other? Lionel slowly turned his attention to the spear domain ring, his heart trying to beat out of his chest. He had hardly sent his mind toward it when his pupils constricted. Chapter 14:16. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 39 seconds AM. Chapter 14:16. Spatial destruction. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The spear domain ring looked as though a hurricane had rampaged through it. Spear peaks had been flattened, spears that managed to survive the carnage had been ripped out of the ground and wildly strewn about, and it might have been a figment of Lionel's imagination, but it also felt like the rumbling storm above was also far more violent than it ever had been before, as though the entire domain had been provoked. Arcs of thick black lightning continuously rained down the tallest peak in the distance. The scene half left Lionel in a trance where he couldn't take his eyes off of the magnificence, and another half of him felt as though the lightning was crashing into his mind, threatening to tear him apart piece by piece. This scene made Lionel realize that what happened to his segmented cube couldn't have possibly been a coincidence. Whatever happened while he was out happened to both. But this realization made something else settle in for Lionel, his mind sparking and his thinking speed heading into overdrive. This opens up a separate sort of possibility for what might have happened to the segmented cube. Originally, if I had to guess what happened to it, I would have assumed that it was related to however I ended up injured. The Void Tower was supposed to be a virtual trial. However, if the change to my mind somehow allowed my dream force to mess with that process, then the lines between virtual and reality could have blurred. If I was forming a virtual reality simulation in the dimensional verse, I wouldn't use technology. The obvious choice would be dream force. If manipulated properly, you could make things as realistic as you wanted them, and rely on the processing strength inherent to the human mind to deal with it all. But let's say that barrier is breached. If you're toying with that line, then injuries would theoretically be the obvious result of crossing a safety line that shouldn't be crossed. That doesn't exactly explain how what should be illusions could injure me, but the answer to that isn't exactly important right this moment. What is important is that if that line was crossed, what else would distort? I would assume that fundamental laws related to gravity, electromagnetism, and especially space would be the first to distort. And, in the case something like that happened, wouldn't the segmented cube obviously collapse no matter how high grade of a treasure it was? Even as his mind worked at warp speed, Lionel did the only thing he could to check this: the spatial bristle rings. Most of the spatial bristle rings Lionel had been traded in for points. But, he had kept just one on his person in case of future issues. But, when Lionel looked at the finger he had kept it on, as expected, it was no longer there. Lionel could imagine that if the space of a spatial bristle ring collapsed on his finger, it would have most definitely taken his finger and most of his hand with it. But, here was his hand, perfectly fine. This isn't the first time I've dealt with warping spatial rings either. Whenever you take a lower-level dimensional ring into a higher one, the space within shrinks. When you take it back to a lower-level dimension, the space within increases once again. The spatial rings are always responding to their environments. The theory is sound. But that is just the first step. The next logical step is how. I didn't think about this earlier because I let my emotions get the best of me, but any collapsing space is not some quiet event. The casing around it would definitely suffer as well. But, why is it that the segmented cube is still perfectly shaved into a jigsaw-like finger glove? The only explanation is that someone or something stabilized it and protected it. There was only one thing that Lionel could think of that could possibly do this. The image of an illusory little girl came to mind. Novel Top 1. Or if the segmented cube had an AI of sorts protecting it, what would that AI decide to do in the case that Lionel's actions placed it and everything it protected in danger? The obvious course of action would be evasive maneuvers. Now, the question was, how could he get it to come back? One problem at a time. Lionel's gaze narrowed, turning his attention back to the spear domain ring. It was clear that whatever hardship the segmented cube had been forced into, so too had the spear domain gone through. But, rather than the spear domain folding or running, it fought back and eventually managed to stabilize its space. The result of that, though, was a far more volatile and dangerous world, not to mention the destruction of many spears. The good news was that many of these spears would be able to heal themselves in time. However, the bad news was far heavier. For one, the difficulty of crossing through the spear domain had increased far more than 1,000-fold. Lionel had been standing within the black grade region of the ring just now, and yet he still felt like his mind was about to collapse. Usually, he appeared in the last place he had left, but seemingly sensing his weakness and protecting him, the spear domain had shuffled him all the way back. Secondly, due to this change, Lionel lost access to even the quasi-bronze spears he had been fond of. This wasn't because they were being repaired as some had still managed to survive. It was because he quite literally could not reach them. Lionel had gone from being able to enter the silver grade region, to not even being able to freely walk throughout the black grade region. Let alone calling out his quasi-gold spear, he would be hard-pressed to claim a black grade spear from the ones around him. It felt like he was right back to square one, standing at the same place he had been when he hadn't even completed his nodes yet. Chapter 14:17. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 14:17. Mage Core Tree. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Toward this, Lionel could only sigh. He had just been feeling like he was making great progress with the spear domain. He had finally gained a small bit of its acknowledgement, his spear force was rapidly evolving every day, and he had finally claimed a quasi-gold spear, only to be shuffled right back to step 1. Lionel couldn't help but feel that there was a small sense of irony to this. The moment Lionel thought that he should maybe stop emphasizing peak spears so much and focus a little bit more on the spears beneath them, he was thrust into a situation where if that would seem like a privilege. Truthfully, Lionel would feel pretty depressed about this setback if he had truly gotten nothing in return for it. But, the change to his lineage factor was just one of the changes that had occurred in Lionel's body during these last few days. If little Blackstar was truly safe and just shuttled off to some pocket of space by the spirit of the segmented cube, then this sort of trade-off wasn't bad. In fact, Lionel could be said to be benefiting. The second most obvious change to Lionel was the evolution of his mage core. Although he couldn't understand what had happened, it almost felt as though an answer to everything he needed was already engraved onto his heart. N0VL next. Koem the mage core had become a looming canopy within Lionel's ethereal glabella. If one was looking from afar, it looked a lot more like an entire forest than a singular tree. Lionel almost couldn't believe it when he saw it again for the first time. The mage core had lost its petals and flower-like characteristics. Instead, it had become an enormous tree with countless millions of leaves and branches. However, what was truly special was the fact that these leaves were multicolored, each representing a different element and each engraved with a rune. These runes looked completely different from the ones Lionel had seen on the blue apes he fought on floor 9, but the feeling they gave off was practically identical. It was an esoteric sort of feeling, as though they were elevated in being and worth, touching upon something Lionel couldn't quite understand fundamentally, but could somehow still grasp. It was almost as though Lionel was reading a book and had stumbled upon a word he couldn't understand. However, thanks to the words and context around it, his guess was accurate as the definition itself. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. If he focused, he could understand what the individual runes meant, but if he wanted a holistic understanding of them all and how they fed into one another and played off of one another, he would need maybe months, probably years. You would think it would be easier than that with all his split minds. But, Lionel found that if he tried to split himself to understand things, the clear definition he had in his head would blur. He didn't have a clear reasoning for why this would be unless, but he had a guess. If whatever was controlling things while my mind was stuck in my dream world comprehended all of these runes at once, then that would mean that the bits and pieces of understanding are all spread out and won't be focused unless I train all of my minds on a singular rune. Lionel frowned slightly. He couldn't ever remember his split minds working like this. Aside from Dream Counter, where he would always assign one mind to a task, the rest had always been fluid and interchangeable. But, this felt as though his split minds had all been tagged and assigned to a separate control center. Wow, it's no wonder, Lionel couldn't deny it. While this made things more difficult on him comprehending the changes to his mage core, it made his thinking speed and efficiency far higher than it ever had been. Before, he had still been stuck in his ways, still trying to use his split minds the same way as always. But, when he fell in line with the changes, it was as though some had pressed down on an accelerator, hard. His thoughts became like bolts of lightning, almost completing before he had even decided to use them. His intention was almost lagging behind his actual thoughts. Lionel was almost lost in the world of his own mind again. But this time, it was completely intentional. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. With the way his mind worked before, when he needed to deduce something, he would work linearly. When one line of thought failed, he would abandon it and then proceed on to the next thought. However, with how it worked now, he could simultaneously think through every possibility and even have them ranked by probability and likelihood before his former self could even switch to a new line of thought. Lionel realized that if he had used this method to think back when he first met Y's star order, it would have been impossible for the old man to read his intentions by shifting through 10 million minds, because every mind would have already had the same intention. It was just that intention would have been broken up into little tidbits and divided 10 million times, making it almost impossible for anyone other than Lionel to piece them together and understand them. The irony of this was that it was using Lionel's several hundred million split minds as though they were all one mind. And somehow that still made it all more efficient. Lionel took a deep breath. Even if I can't understand my mage core entirely though, the result is almost too obvious. Lionel reached out a hand and force surged toward him as though it had a mind of its own. He could always do this. However, he had never been able to replicate this feat in a world of dense anarchic force. Most of Lionel's ability to use atmospheric force was locked away in this place. Even the golden-scaled koi fish could only pull in force fused with anarchic force. But right now, so long as it was an element found on his mage core, Lionel could force it toward himself, ignoring all the anarchic force around him. Suddenly, the air sparked and a ball of red-gold flames formed and began to rotate upon Lionel's palm. Scarlet Star Force. Not just any Scarlet Force, but fifth-dimensional Scarlet Star Force. Chapter 1418. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 37 seconds AM. Chapter 1418. Of all people? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel didn't know what to think for a long time. This force, this very same force that had been the bane of his existence ever since he had awakened it, was now sitting obediently in his palm. Lionel knew it was lacking in many ways. This force on his palm now compared to the force he could emit from his innate node in the same way force crystals differed from pure force crystals. The gap was enormous. However, it was still with this very same force that Lionel had wiped out a troop of three-finger cult members, and then proceeded to toy with a variant invalid as though each was no more than an ant. And now, he could suddenly use as much of this force as he wanted. To say that this change was huge was an understatement. Lionel quickly snuffed out the flame, realizing that Aina was beginning to sweat beneath the heat. If not for her, he might not have realized something was wrong until the walls began to melt. If this wasn't a seventh-dimensional world, the air would have already heated enough to combust everything around it into a hail of flames. The force on Lionel's palm shifted. He went through water force, spatial force, light force, star force. He even managed to gather enough earth force that he could influence the ground beneath him a bit. Though none of these were as exaggerated as the formation of a ball of scarlet star force, Lionel could still tell that the strength behind each force was far more than it had been in the past, and the only possible explanation was the runes that made up the leaves of his mage core. Lionel summarized the next few changes to his body quickly. His fourth-dimensional innate node, the very one he had taken back from Miguel, had found a home in his left kidney. An odd sort of dream force barrier wrapped tightly around it. Lionel hadn't noticed it at first due to its small size, but after a diligent scan, he couldn't possibly miss it. Lionel felt that he could puncture this dream force barrier whenever he wanted, as his dream force affinity seemed to have finally returned to him, but he didn't do it. This dream force barrier seemed to make the innate node ignorant to the fact it had returned to his body. This allowed him to benefit from having true Scarlet Star Force circulate throughout his body without the drawbacks. When Lionel was ready for it to evolve, he felt that he could just remove a layer of the barrier, allowing it to grow in size. Like this, Lionel could get the benefit of the accelerated growth of one innate node and the steady growth of another. He had a feeling that this would greatly help his comprehension as he watched the destruction runes grow naturally. The next change he noticed was in the number of destruction runes he had comprehended. But, since these were fused with his mage core, he left alone. The final change, however, was one that left Lionel speechless once again, something that had happened far too often today. Lionel waved a hand. The world around him seemed to distort, delicate sparkling lines of blue coming together until they formed a perfect cube. Everything about the hologram was exact. There was a 0% margin of error, completely unrealistic even to the standards of the higher dimensions. Without fail, every side was exactly 4 inches long, not a measure more, not a measure less. However, the most shocking thing was that this image had been projected from Lionel's mind. The first thing Lionel did when he noticed this was panic again. Had he been flung back into a dream world without his knowledge? But after a moment, he calmed again. No, this wasn't a dream world, this was definitely the real world. There was no doubt about it. But, he had gained the ability to project his dream force. No, it isn't like that. Within the confines of my starry spirit domain, I can project dream force. However, outside of it, I cannot. Even within the range of my internal sight is impossible, it only seems to be something I can accomplish within this domain. Without his tail active, Lionel's starry spirit domain was barely a foot out from his skin. With it active, it had a radius of about 5 meters. Whatever change this sensory domain had allowed, it became like an extension of Lionel's dream world. Lionel had known there would be a lot to explore when it came to this new domain of his, but he hadn't expected to stumble upon the first discovery like this. Lionel had dismissed this ability when he was stuck in his dream world, thinking that it would only make him a good teacher and communicator. But, now feeling it in the real world, he realized just how game-changing this ability would be. He almost wanted to stand up right this moment and begin crafting, but that was when it hit him like a ton of bricks. I lost little Tolly too, Lionel's fists clenched. He had to find a way to reverse this as soon as possible, he knew there had to be a way. Lionel. Lionel was suddenly tackled down by a soft body. Before he could understand what was happening, 2 small palms clasped his cheeks, pressing them together as though to check he was truly alive. Lionel's lips pursed out of his control, his eyes blinking as he looked up toward Aina who already sat over him. Seeing the worry in Aina's eyes, Lionel's heart softened a bit. But, when she tried to kiss him, he dodged and hoisted her over his shoulder. No time for horniness today, ma'am, we have work to do. I have to find out how to save an adorable little mink and an equally as adorable silver blob. Aina was so stunned that she didn't even react to Lionel conveniently squeezing one of her large cheeks as she was halved over his shoulder. Did this man just accuse her of being horny? This man of all people? Chapter 14:19. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 14:19. Void contract. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again, soft. Lionel nodded to himself. Aina seemed to snap awake at these words, slapping Lionel's hand away from her ass and pushing herself up and off his shoulder. She harumphed, pulling her skirt down to hide anything indecent and smoothing out the wrinkles. Once she was finished, she gave Lionel a nice, long glare. But in return, she received a chuckle. What's with that look? Weren't you just happy to see me? Not anymore. Oh. If I give you a kiss, will it make you feel better? No one wants your kiss, Aina spoke, waving a hand and walking out in front, ignoring Lionel. Lionel laughed, swiftly catching up and taking Aina's hand. Though she put up some mock resistance, she eventually stopped. It was all too easy to tell the difference. With her strength, shaking off his hand if she really wanted to wouldn't be difficult at all. Where is this place? Lionel couldn't help but notice that this place was particularly white. It was completely unlike the dark regions he had gotten used to in the last several days. Well, aside from the 10th floor of the Void Tower, that is. This place, though, was obviously not in the Void Tower and it had a distinct medicinal scent in the air. It's a hospital, obviously. Who asked you to come out of the tower with a hole in your chest? What the hell happened to you? Aina frowned, her slightly annoyed tone shifting to concern as she looked toward Lionel. The more she thought about it, the less it made sense to her as well. It was supposed to be a simulation. During her own death, she had become an old woman after expending all of her life force and her bones practically crumbled under the weight of her flesh. It was quite gruesome, but she eventually woke up just fine as though nothing had happened. If even a death like that couldn't harm her, then what could have possibly harmed Lionel? I'm not sure. A hospital? It wasn't free, right? How did you pay for it? Did you get leaderboard rewards already? About that, your cousin, my cousin? Novel top 1. Or G. Lionel's brows shot up. The only cousin he knew of was Noah, but he had a feeling that Aina wasn't talking about him. Noah should be just as unable to pay for his treatment as Aina was. It wouldn't make sense for Aina to be referring to him. Yes. His name was Sio, he said he was the fourth Nova. Lionel's eyes narrowed. The fourth Nova. Though there were over 1 billion recognized to be among the Morales family's Nova generation, the only ones who gained numbers and titles like this were the 7 who had awakened both lineage factors. What did he ask for in return? Lionel still had the segmented cube and the spear domain with him, so it was obvious that his cousin hadn't asked for them. Though, even if he had, Lionel doubted the spear domain would leave him. As for the segmented cube, it seemed to have a spirit of its own. However, in its current state, it was just an empty shell anyone could take for themselves. Regardless, Fourth Nova hadn't taken it either. He said that you owe him one favor and he wants 10% interest compounded daily. He made me sign a void contract, which is apparently a legal document overseen by the Void Senate. Any disputes are handled through the Senate or its branches. Lionel felt uneasy hearing these words. The interest alone was ridiculous, but the favor sounded. Lionel didn't believe that Aina would ever make him return a favor that was too ridiculous, so there were definitely stipulations. But, as for what they were, he didn't know. Can I see the contract? Aina handed over what looked like a pendant without its necklace to him after hesitating a moment, and his starry spirit domain acted all on its own. Its information was displayed before him and he read through it all in the blink of an eye. But, by the time he had finished, his expression was as dark as the Void Palace's usual environment. He realized now why Aina had seemingly hesitated, even if just for a moment. The collateral for this contract was essentially Aina's life. Even though the Void Palace didn't allow death, slavery was another matter entirely. If Lionel couldn't fulfill the contract within a month's time, Aina would be forced to work under Sio. Lionel's mother had already been here for over 20 years, and she still couldn't leave the Void Palace freely. This meant that even if this contract was only observed within these walls, something that was unlikely to be true to begin with, that Aina would be stuck fulfilling this contract for at least that long. And, considering the fact the Void Palace, and by proxy the Void Senate, were the most powerful existences in the human domain, even leaving this place didn't mean that you could ignore a contract witnessed by them. This much alone was more than enough to piss Lionel off. Aina was unaware, so he didn't blame her. But, so long as he held on for just one more day, he could have completely healed himself after his recharged. In fact, so long as Lionel had been given a space without anarchic force to contend with, his healing factor would have been more than enough to allow him to recover to his full strength. Beyond this, the description left for the favor left Lionel unsettled. The restrictions placed on it were heavy. Aina had insisted that such a favor couldn't go against Lionel's moral code, but as a rebuttal Fourth Nova seemed to slip in that said moral code had to be provable by Lionel's actions. That line alone was something Lionel knew Aina wouldn't accept unless she felt pushed into a corner. It practically undid all of the restrictions so long as the clause was used cleverly. Lionel didn't think his mood could get any worse, but when he saw the bill, his temper threatened to flare up again, and only grew worse when he recognized the green hair of the woman across from him. Chapter 1420. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 33 seconds AM. Chapter 1420. A month. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Aina's frown was even deeper than Lionel's, her palm pressed down hard on the counter, applying enough pressure to make the marbling tremble. And yet, her voice was as calm and cold as ice. Golden glow root. White azala oak. Silkworm grass. These are all fifth-dimensional herbs priced at barely a few dozen kilograms of herb Oregon itchweed. Crimson hair skunk root. Queen spruce bushel. Poison thistle plum. These aren't even medicines, they're quite literally poison. I wouldn't have allowed you within a mile of him if you had entered with these things. Do you take us for idiots? The green-haired woman continued to look toward them, not looking away in the slightest. There wasn't a hint of embarrassment on her face. The price is as stated. 1,029,293 void points and 2 void merits. Aina's irises flashed with a golden glow, the marbled counter cracking. The green-haired woman looked down at the result, her eyes narrowing. It took far more than just a bit of strength to cause such a thing to happen, especially when there was no wind-up. The price is now double. The green-haired woman reached forward with lightning speed to take back the invoice, catching Aina off guard. But, before she could succeed, she found her wrist lightly gripped. The strength wasn't too strong, and it could even be said that the hold on her hand was more comfortable than not. And yet, she couldn't seem to budge even a single inch. Her name was Rosamond, I believe. Is that right? Lionel said lightly. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. His anger seemed to have vanished into the wind. Rosamond was the very same woman who had manned the medical center at Village 0012. Truthfully, Lionel hadn't done much of anything to her. In addition, after displaying the strength he had during the true selection, and subsequently within the Void Tower, even if what he did past Floor 9 was ignored, he had already proven himself to be more than worth of the amethyst token. N0VL Next. Come in doing that, the reason Rosamond should have had for being disgusted with him should have likewise vanished. But, it seems that Rosamond was the type of person who didn't like to take losses. Lionel had left her medicinal center alone because he didn't want to be the reason other people didn't get treatment, but she had taken his actions to be out of fear of her. So, he had blatantly stated that if she ever became the reason one of his friends or brothers couldn't get treatment, he wouldn't care about the Void Palace's rules and would directly kill her. Clearly, she had taken these words very personally, even to the point of trying to retaliate in this way. With the way the Void Palace worked, everything run on the power of its students. There was a reason why Vega could offer Aina free discounts from stores, and that was because they were controlled by her faction to begin with. Every establishment was either owned by a faction or an individual student. This was for an obvious reason: they were raising the future leaders of the human domain and as such, treated them with the proper freedom, within certain parameters, of course. So long as they remained within the Void Palace, didn't have children, and didn't kill, they could practically do as they pleased, all the way up until even running the daily functions of the Void Palace through the Void Senate. These rules weren't too oppressive at all. They had to stay in the Void Palace so that they could constantly be under a state of duress and training. If they could leave as they pleased, who would choose to remain here? By then, the effectiveness would plummet. As for children, they couldn't have little brats running around the Void Palace, right? And killing was an even more obvious measure that protected everyone from being pushed too far. However, it was also because of this approach that this was happening at all. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Inwardly, Lionel smiled. He didn't believe that only this family controlled all of the hospitals and medical centers of the Void Palace. There were definitely others. Signs pointed toward the fact that CO had brought Aina and him here on purpose, knowing the prices would be inflated. As for how he knew that Lionel had a grudge with Rosamond, that was something that Lionel would have to find out on his own. Still, it was clear that this fourth cousin of his was schemer. It was just unfortunate that he had already touched past Lionel's bottom line because as of this moment, he was playing with Aina's life. However, Lionel managed to keep his calm, sliding the invoice off of the table and taking it into his hands. He didn't care for the green-haired woman's answer to his question, he already knew the truth. This is the invoice, huh? I'll be taking my copy. Be sure to charge that to that cousin of mine. Lionel handed the invoice to Aina. Since he didn't have a spatial ring anymore, he'd have to rely on this girlfriend of his. As they walked out, his mind was spinning. There were too many loopholes in the contract. Just with a glance, he could see dozens. If CO was determined to take advantage of them, he could do so. In fact, he could just hide for the next coming month and show up 31 days later claiming that Lionel never paid him, using that as an excuse to sweep Aina away. With this contract, CO could even go as far as to force Aina to fight in the air wars for him. While killing amongst heirs was prohibited, killing the helpers of heirs was a different matter entirely. If not for this, why would Valiant Heart Mountain have been so scared to participate? Or, there was the possibility that if his mind was more sinister, Lionel shut his mind down from continuing down that path as quickly as he thought it, but with his current thinking speed, he had already plunged down a seemingly endless rabbit hole. The more he considered it, the more enraged he would become. There was only one option. He had to find a way to void this contract. And, for that, he needed to read the rules. To make matters more difficult, he needed a method that didn't rely on the Void Senate, and he only had a month to both find it and put it into action. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1421. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 32 seconds AM. Chapter 1421. A month. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Ana's frown was even deeper than Lionel's. Her palm pressed down hard on the counter, applying enough pressure to make the marbling tremble. And yet, her voice was as calm and cold as ice. Golden glow root. White azala oak. Silkworm grass. These are all fifth-dimensional herbs priced at barely a few dozen kilograms of herb Oregon itchweed. Crimson hair skunk root. Queen spruce bushel. Poison thistle plum. These aren't even medicines, they're quite literally poison. I wouldn't have allowed you within a mile of him if you had entered with these things. Do you take us for idiots? The green-haired woman continued to look toward them, not looking away in the slightest. There wasn't a hint of embarrassment on her face. The price is as stated. 1,029,293 void points and 2 void merits. Ana's irises flashed with a golden glow, the marbled counter cracking. The green-haired woman looked down at the result, her eyes narrowing. It took far more than just a bit of strength to cause such a thing to happen, especially when there was no wind-up. The price is now double. The green-haired woman reached forward with lightning speed to take back the invoice, catching Ana off guard. But, before she could succeed, she found her wrist lightly gripped. The strength wasn't too strong, and it could even be said that the hold on her hand was more comfortable than not. And yet, she couldn't seem to budge even a single inch. Novelbin, her name was Rosamond, I believe. Is that right? Lionel said lightly. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. His anger seemed to have vanished into the wind. Rosamond was the very same woman who had manned the medical center at Village 0012. Truthfully, Lionel hadn't done much of anything to her. In addition, after displaying the strength he had during the true selection, and subsequently within the Void Tower, even if what he did past Floor 9 was ignored, he had already proven himself to be more than worth of the amethyst token. In doing that, the reason Rosamond should have had for being disgusted with him should have likewise vanished. But, it seems that Rosamond was the type of person who didn't like to take losses. Lionel had left her medicinal center alone because he didn't want to be the reason other people didn't get treatment, but she had taken his actions to be out of fear of her. So, he had blatantly stated that if she ever became the reason one of his friends or brothers couldn't get treatment, he wouldn't care about the Void Palace's rules and would directly kill her. Clearly, she had taken these words very personally, even to the point of trying to retaliate in this way. With the way the Void Palace worked, everything run on the power of its students. There was a reason why Vega could offer Ana free discounts from stores, and that was because they were controlled by her faction to begin with. Every establishment was either owned by a faction or an individual student. This was for an obvious reason: they were raising the future leaders of the human domain and as such, treated them with the proper freedom, within certain parameters, of course. So long as they remained within the Void Palace, didn't have children, and didn't kill, they could practically do as they pleased, all the way up until even running the daily functions of the Void Palace through the Void Senate. These rules weren't too oppressive at all. They had to stay in the Void Palace so that they could constantly be under a state of duress and training. If they could leave as they pleased, who would choose to remain here? By then, the effectiveness would plummet. As for children, they couldn't have little brats running around the Void Palace, right? And killing was an even more obvious measure that protected everyone from being pushed too far. However, it was also because of this approach that this was happening at all. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Ned inwardly, Lionel smiled. He didn't believe that only this family controlled all of the hospitals and medical centers of the Void Palace. There were definitely others. Signs pointed toward the fact that Sio had brought Aina and him here on purpose, knowing the prices would be inflated. As for how he knew that Lionel had a grudge with Rosamond, that was something that Lionel would have to find out on his own. Still, it was clear that this fourth cousin of his was schemer. It was just unfortunate that he had already touched past Lionel's bottom line because as of this moment, he was playing with Aina's life. However, Lionel managed to keep his calm, sliding the invoice off of the table and taking it into his hands. He didn't care for the green-haired woman's answer to his question, he already knew the truth. This is the invoice, huh? I'll be taking my copy. Be sure to charge that to that cousin of mine. Lionel handed the invoice to Aina. Since he didn't have a spatial ring anymore, he'd have to rely on this girlfriend of his. As they walked out, his mind was spinning. There were too many loopholes in the contract. Just with a glance, he could see dozens. If Sio was determined to take advantage of them, he could do so. In fact, he could just hide for the next coming month and show up 31 days later claiming that Lionel never paid him, using that as an excuse to sweep Aina away. With this contract, Sio could even go as far as to force Aina to fight in the air wars for him. While killing amongst heirs was prohibited, killing the helpers of heirs was a different matter entirely. If not for this, why would Valiant Heart Mountain have been so scared to participate? Or, there was the possibility that if his mind was more sinister, Lionel shut his mind down from continuing down that path as quickly as he thought it, but with his current thinking speed, he had already plunged down a seemingly endless rabbit hole. The more he considered it, the more enraged he would become. There was only one option. He had to find a way to void this contract. And, for that, he needed to read the rules. To make matters more difficult, he needed a method that didn't rely on the Void Senate, and he only had a month to both find it and put it into action. Chapter 1422. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 31 seconds AM. Chapter 1422, Wide Grin. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Originally, Lionel wanted to avoid the Void Senate because he had a feeling that it was likely that Sio would have someone to rely on that could make things difficult for him. However, when he caught up to speed with everything that had happened, he was even more assured in the fact he couldn't rely on them. The fall of the stalwart polearm party, the rise of the sword factions as a result, and his dad. Well, being his dad. Lionel rubbed his forehead. This old man is always giving me problems. Can't go one day without ruining things. If Velasco could hear Lionel now, maybe he would have to smack some sense into his son. It was clearly the other way around. Why did this brat suddenly sound so exasperated? Aina, who had been in a bad mood, couldn't help but giggle. Much of this information she had just filled Lionel in on were things she had fished out of Vega. The knowledge of a gold faction head was quite invaluable, so though Aina never had any intention of joining Vega's faction, she still gained herself a large well of information just by listening and asking questions. She had to find a way to distract herself from the frozen screen that loomed above her head, after all. There was only so much worrying she could do if she didn't even understand exactly what was happening. It was a good thing that Aina had done this as well, because everything in the Void Palace cost some sort of price. Everything. Novel bin living accommodations, food, water, even information, all had a price tag. There were several information networks in the Void Palace controlled by various families. Just basic information would cost you hundreds of Void points, let alone something as sensitive as the overturning of a shared majority in the Senate. This saved Lionel a lot of time, though, because now he didn't have to walk around aimlessly. The Void Palace, on a normal day, wasn't too much unlike a college campus, if you could get over the heavy perpetual fog and the lack of sun at all times. However, it also felt very unorganized. There were buildings of all sorts of shapes and sizes, serving all sorts of different functions strewn around without any sort of real city planning of any sort. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Calm to experience faster update speed. Restaurants were right by clothing shops, which were right by residences, which were also right by medicinal halls and libraries. There was even what looked like a small farm randomly irrigated between what was a butcher shop and a clothing shop that displayed animal furs. There was no order at all. Alongside these odd choices in building and in land use, there were what looked like kiosks every block or so. Aina told Lionel that those were locations to exchange void points for things from a virtual library of sorts. But the situation was more complicated than that. Apparently, according to Aina, there were zones. The level of the void point kiosk would be decided by the level of the zone. This meant at lower level zones, you could only trade for things of a certain level, barred off from higher levels. These zones were mostly divided into the level of students that could enter them, and there were further special zones controlled by factions as well. Regardless, outside of the lower class zones which could be entered for free, higher class zones with better accommodations, and assumingly better city planning than this, all cost void points to enter as well. This zone, what is it? Well. Aina bit her lip, looking away. It's the lowest class quadrant zone there is. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Quadrant? Oh, did I not climb high enough to make it to Galaxy? That's unfortunate. Lionel didn't really know what happened after he got trapped, so he just assumed what must have happened. He thought that Aina's reaction was to spare him from the embarrassment. In truth, he didn't like the fact he had failed, but the experience with Amory had already forced him to humble himself a bit. He still didn't like the fact he had to use his bow that day. No, well, Aina took a breath and just explained what happened. Lionel's brows jumped when he heard he had climbed to the 74th floor. How was such a thing even possible? There should be something wrong with the tower, right? Maybe his dream force had affected its output. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. This was the best explanation Lionel could think of. There was no way he could output 7th dimensional power. If he could, he might as well forget all of this and start conquering the human domain right away. Ah, so it's like that, Lionel sighed. Someone had come to bring Aina her verification as a galaxy-ranked disciple while he was in a coma. But, when Aina asked about Lionel, the person only shook their head, not having an answer. It was likely that the higher-ups were still deliberating on what exactly had happened. So, as of now, let alone a galaxy rank, Lionel didn't technically have any rank right now. Lionel couldn't blame them. Even he didn't believe he had climbed to the 74th floor, so why would others? Lionel suddenly came to a grinding halt, his eyes flashing. And then, he grinned like a madman. Aina, who had continued to walk ahead, paused when she realized Lionel's arm was tugging at her hand. Lionel? Are you all right? Seeing Lionel grin when she knew that he would usually be sad in this sort of situation made Aina a bit worried. Was his head all right? If I'm right, I just found our loophole. Lionel's grin widened. Even if this didn't get Lionel out of the void contract, he was certain that there was some rule or loophole he could take advantage of in his current rankless state. He just had to find what that rule was. And, if he was even luckier, this much would be enough to void 4th Nova's void contract with Aina. Aina, bring me somewhere where we can read all of the Void Palace's rules in excruciating detail. I'm sure there has to be a place like that. Aina blinked and then nodded slowly, thinking of a place. Chapter 1423. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 30 seconds AM. Chapter 1423, 527. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The best location that Aina could think of that would meet Lionel's requirements was a branch of the Void Senate. The Senate's main duties were related to setting laws that governed everything from the lowest to the highest levels of the Void Palace. But, there were also many smaller tasks, at least relatively speaking, that they also had to deal with. These branches were in place to deal with these smaller functions. For one, the Senate branches were where missions could be taken up and rewards for said missions could be accepted. It would also be the place where Lionel and Aina would have to go in order to receive their monthly stipend for remaining on the leaderboards, so long as they could maintain their top 3 positions, that is. The second function of the branches was as a sort of asylum. A lot like the embassies found within a country, a branch functioned as the one location in the whole of the Void Palace where fights and battles were not allowed. Most likely wouldn't use the branch for this purpose, but it was still a rule that everyone was aware of because the penalty for breaking it was especially harsh. Simply put, the dignity of the Senate could not be infringed upon for any reason. The third function of the branch was as a sort of disciplinary squad. There were very few rules on the Void Palace other than the main three always mentioned, but there still had to be a semblance of order. Those who took up positions in the Senate branches were tasked with making sure any commotion remained to a level that was manageable. This didn't sound like a big deal on the surface, but when things like faction wars reached a fever pitch, only the Senate could be relied upon to settle tensions and make sure no one crossed any lines that couldn't be come back from. Likewise, the branches were here to ensure that no one died. No, more accurately, they were here to ensure that no one was killed or murdered. And, in the case that someone was, they would be swiftly brought in and put on trial for what would likely be an inevitable execution. Death in the Void Palace was more common than the no-killing rules seemed to imply. Most would die on the Void battlefield. However, among those that wouldn't, there were any number of ways. Poison, succumbing to injuries, being ravaged by cursed beasts that roamed these lands. There were even cases of people starving to death. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed in an anarchic force-rich environment. Even higher dimensional beings were in a constant state of fight or flight, their force always working. As such, their hunger and thirst were no different from mortals. If they went a few weeks without food, or even a week without water, they would already find themselves towing the line of life or death, just like any other third-dimensional existence. This was a problem that Lionel had in the back of his mind already. He hadn't been worrying about it at all because he would always have water with the segmented cube, and cleaning cursed beast meat to consume wasn't an issue so long as he had cleansing waters. But now, this was a problem he would have to contend with and deal with as soon as possible. But first, Lionel and Aina walked into the Senate branch. Much like the hospital, it was completely out of place. While it wasn't a large building, it was still prim and proper. The grass out front was a lush and almost obsidian black, the foundation and walls had been laid of evenly cut brick, and the inside smelled of fresh pine and a hint of citric. There was only a single person as the counter, but there only really needed to be one. State your purpose, the young man almost commanded. NovelBin. Lionel gazed toward this person, feeling that they were quite powerful. Even the weakest member of the Senate was in the latter third of the sixth dimension, and this young man was definitely no different. He probably made more void merits just sitting here than Lionel would gain risking his life for months. Probably. As for whether or not that was true, Lionel actually had no idea, and he didn't like wasting time speculating on things he had no real tangible information about. I would like a complete record of the Void Palace's rules. The young man, who was mostly disinterested, narrowed his eyes when he heard this. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. Are you trying to fuck with me? I don't have the patience, kid. I'll give you one more chance, but that's only because I'm in a good mood. Lionel refrained from laughing. If this was him in a good mood, he'd hate to see the opposite. Toward these words, Lionel only smiled. Senior, I recently got swept up into some void contract troubles, and I want to see if there's any method of getting out. I don't want to leave any stone unturned, so I'd like to go through all of the rules to see if there's anything I can do. Hearing such an explanation, the young man's stance softened somewhat, but he still shook his head. The ignorant truly are fearless. Fine, fine. You live and you learn. Good luck, kid. Clank. The young man brought out a pendant that looked quite similar to the one that had held the original contract. But the jewel on it was a different color. Aina's had been a really pale silver, but this seemed much brighter. It was a detail Lionel noted. Then, clank. The young man brought out another pendant. Then another. Then another. Then another. By the time he was finished, the whole counter was covered in what Lionel counted to be 527 such pendants. The Void Palace was founded over 500,000 years ago. Each pendant represents 1,000 years of laws and amendments. Have fun. Chapter 1424. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 28 seconds AM. Chapter 1424. Maybe? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's lip twitched. Even for him, this was a lot. He could tell with a glance that the brightness of the gem on the pendant was likely a function of how much information was within. The contract between Aina and Sio had been about 1,000 words. If it was multiplied by the difference in brightness, then that would mean that there would be about 100 billion words since it functions on a logarithmic scale. If it was multiplied by a further 500, it wouldn't take me that long at all. In fact, I would probably finish each one in a few minutes, especially since I don't have to read with my eyes. But that wouldn't be too hard for any fifth-dimensional existence to do. 100 billion words is only a petabyte of information. I highly doubt what looks to be a sixth-dimension device would max out at that quantity. For this senior to be acting like this, it has to be even worse than my estimates. Lionel took a breath and picked up one of the pendants, restraining his starry spirit domain so that it didn't act on its own again. I would be careful if I were you. The memory pendants work by projecting all of the information into your mind at once using a small bit of dream force. Even seventh-dimensional existences don't bother memorizing all of these rules. It's easier to just look up exactly what they want when the issue comes up. Dream force? Lionel blinked. The young man smiled. Even if you have some dream force affinity, I wouldn't advise it. I already assumed you had some sensory type ability since you dared to ask for this. Only sensory maniacs like you guys would ask for something so ridiculous. But a small amount of dream force affinity isn't going to help you with that amount of information. Unless you're a savant or at least in the seventh dimension, I wouldn't advise it. Hearing these words, Aina began to get a bit worried as well. How about we find another way? Or, maybe you could try to narrow down the search a bit? She probed. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Lionel exhaled a breath, looking at the pendant. What's the worst that can happen if I use the memory pendant, senior? Well, it isn't life-threatening. But you'd be forced to stand there until your mind processes all of it. Since you're in the fifth dimension and have some dream force affinity, I'd say it would probably take you anywhere from a week to a month depending on a few factors. So, you can imagine how long it would take to go through all of them. Plus, that would only really work if you really needed to find very specific information. It sounds like you want to memorize all of it by your tone. That mountain is even taller. Even though the dream force will help you memorize a bit easier than you otherwise would, it's not to the point that you'd become an overnight genius. You'll easily become overwhelmed, and by the third pendant, you'll already start forgetting things. By the seventh pendant, you likely wouldn't even remember anything from the first. And that doesn't mention the fact that my shift ends pretty soon. I might be willing to let you stand there, but I can't promise that my colleagues will too. Some of them are pricks, and entering a state like that is dangerous if there's no one around to protect you. Novelbin, I see. Lionel's gaze narrowed. He had already decided to gamble. He had forgotten about the new way in which his brain worked. If he really went at this, he believed he could do it. Lionel's internal sight surged. As though expecting this, the young man shook his head. He already knew this would happen, that's why he had said the ignorant were fearless. Never mind, it didn't matter. He would be harmed a bit, and when he came out, he would have learned a lesson. The young man moved to put the other pendants away. He had only brought them all out for dramatic effect to begin with, but it had fallen on blind eyes since neither Lionel nor Aina seemed to understand what kind of heft these pendants had behind them. But, before the young man could finish packing away even a single pendant, a sharp intake of breath caught his attention. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. He looked up curiously, but his expression changed when he saw that Lionel's gaze had regained its clarity. How long has it been? Lionel asked Aina. Lionel had already expected that he would find a different person at the counter, so he didn't even look in that direction. The largest reason he had dared to do this was because he trusted that if he was wrong in his evaluation, Aina would protect him. But, instead of getting an answer, all he got was a beauty looking back at him with a blank expression. The young man abruptly rose from his seat, not understanding what he was seeing. If he could wave a hand and say Lionel just faked it, everything would be fine. But the problem was that he most definitely couldn't do that. His own senses were too sharp. He had felt Lionel's internal sight sink into that pendant. There was no way to fake that. The moment internal sight touched that pendant, the process would start, and there was no easy way to extricate yourself without completely reading through its contents. There was simply no way to fake this. Aina? It's been a few seconds, maybe? Aina's voice tinged with uncertainty. Lionel blinked for a moment before he grinned ear to ear. This was excellent. Without hesitation, he took up a second pendant, then a third, then a fourth. He blazed through them one after another, not stopping for a single moment. Then, just 10 or so minutes later, he had gone through them all, each word, letter and punctuation mark perfectly memorized. Chapter 1425. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 27 seconds AM. Chapter 1425. Green. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel exhaled, his mind rolling. He slid through the 500,000 years worth of laws and regulations as though he was flipping through the pages of a book, his mind assimilating it all with an ease that astonished even himself. Most of it was completely useless, nonsensical laws that no longer meant anything in the current day and age. But others were far more interesting. Lionel organized it all, crossing out what was useless and also throwing out rules made redundant or toothless by later amendments. And, eventually, he came to exactly what he wanted. Lionel grinned. This was exactly what he needed. The void contract was one matter, however how he could take advantage of his limbo-like status was a different matter entirely. Since the Void Senate would likely try to play games with him, let them. He would enjoy his short period of free reign while they twiddled their thumbs. As for the matter of the void contract, it was surprisingly easy. The rule was under a set of amendments put into place about 400,000 years ago when the Void Palace's anarchic force concentration had weakened enough to allow lower-level dimensional beings in. The free-for-all rules began to weigh too heavily. As of right now, the only rule seemed to be no killing. But, what would one do if a higher dimensional being insisted on crippling you? There was really nothing much you could do at all. That was, until these amendments were put into place. There were many provisions put in place, but the only one Lionel really cared about right now was a clause related to void contracts. According to the stipulations, so long as a contract involved a deal including a lower-ranked disciple, said disciple could use 3 void merits to remove themselves from responsibility. One would think that Lionel was out of luck. He couldn't simultaneously try to use his limbo-like status and hope to get treatment as a lower-ranked disciple at the same time. That wouldn't make sense or be possible. However, it had to be remembered that the contract wasn't signed between Lionel and Xiao. It was signed between Aina and Xiao. Lionel had been in a coma at the time, meaning he couldn't consent to a contract even if he wanted to. Luckily, Xiao should be a sector-ranked disciple, just like Lionel's mother, while Aina was a galaxy-ranked disciple. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. In addition, even if Xiao wasn't a sector-ranked disciple, there were divisions among ranks that could be used as well. There were 9 divisions within each level, which was why climbing ranks was so difficult. So long as Xiao wasn't a level 1 galaxy-ranked disciple, Aina would still be able to break free. Now, the only question was one of getting void merits. If Lionel was lucky, he might be able to kill 2 birds with 1 stone and take advantage of his limbo status at the same time. However, Lionel had also deduced days ago that void merits were far more valuable than void points. It likely wouldn't be easy to get them even if he went all out in the next month. And, according to the rules, while void points were transferable by anyone, only factions, parties and the Void Palace itself could hand out void merits. This meant that if Lionel wanted to get Aina the merits she needed, they would either need to do a mission that paid them both equally, and was thus worth a total of 6 void merits, a mission that would without a doubt be incredibly dangerous, or Aina would need to somehow earn them on her own. But it was exactly then that a spark went off in Lionel's head. That's it. For every top 3 spot you have on the leaderboards, you gain an equivalent number of void merits. Aina, how many leaderboards are you on right now? The young man's lip twitched when he heard this question. What the hell was going on here? First this kid flashed through the pendants like they were nothing, and now he was treating leaderboards as though they were nothing? If he didn't know better, the young man would have checked these pendants personally to make sure they weren't broken, but even if he wouldn't get stuck here for a month like Lionel should have, it would have still been a day. He didn't feel like doing that. Plus, all 527 couldn't possibly be broken, right? I believe that I'm on 20. The young man sputtered and coughed. 10 leaderboards? Aina and Lionel looked toward the young man as though he was the weird one. Eventually, they looked back toward one another as though he wasn't there. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net, I assume that's 10 current leaderboards and 10 all-time ones, right? Aina nodded. And what placement do you have on them? Only the top 3 matters. I'm second of 3 of the current leaderboards and first on the rest of them. Same for the all-time leaderboards. Lionel grinned. Sounds like my girlfriend is pretty amazing. Novelbin, just a little bit. Aina smiled, her amber eyes glistening. The current leaderboards give 3 void merits for first place and -1 downward. The all-time leaderboards are more complicated. They give out a pool of 30 for top 10 and it ticks down by 1 for top 11 to 20 and so on. Either way, only top 10 matters for you. Depending on how many active members of the top 10 there are currently in the Void Palace, you'll split those 30 merit points with them. So you have 27 void merits from current leaderboards plus 300 void merits divided by however many people you're sharing them with. Do you know? Lionel thought the answer might be 0, initially, but after hearing her previous explanation, he knew that wouldn't be true. There's one. Her name is Triana Vierer. Lionel nodded. In that case, you get 66% of the amount you're in first place for and 33% of the ones you're not. So 27 plus 150, so 177 void merits in the end. It looks like you'll have more than enough. While Lionel and Aina were happy about this change, there was a young woman whose monthly void merit quota had taken an enormous plummet thanks to this change, and her hair also happened to be green. Chapter 1426. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 26 seconds AM. Chapter 1426. What can stop us? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel and Aina left the Senate branch after completing a few other things. But Lionel still seemed lost in thought as though he was still trying to work something out. What's wrong? Aina asked. From what Lionel had said earlier, it sounded as if all their troubles were dealt with. Did my cousin say anything else to you? Anything that might sound suspicious? Anything that stood out? Aina fell deep into her thoughts, but after a moment, she shook her head. She couldn't think of anything like that. Back then, she had been very focused on the contract and negotiations, so she had practically memorized every little thing Sio said. But, even then, she couldn't come up with anything like what Lionel had asked for. Is there a problem? I'm not sure. Lionel said honestly. It just feels too easy. On the one hand, the void merit rule should be rarely used. Void merits alone are difficult to gather in the first place. Although you'll have almost 200 at the end of this month, there are very few people who could boast such a thing. The number of individuals on the leaderboards to begin with are barely a fraction of the number of students in the Void Palace, and that doesn't even consider the fact that only the top 3 get to enjoy void merits in return in the first place. Then there's the fact that anyone who could earn void merits through any method to begin with wouldn't normally be people that would need to get out of a contract. They would be geniuses that would be easily taken in by a faction or party without issue. Something like selling themselves in exchange for help would never happen. So, that would make the use of this rule even rarer. Then that should be a good thing. Why are you worried? Like I said, it just feels too easy. If my cousin is intelligent, he'll look at things from all angles. He should know both how valuable void merits are and the fact that you'll earn a lot in just a couple more weeks. If I was him, this chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Lionel's gaze went into a daze for a moment as he activated an ability he had only just created. He called it Dream Perspective. With Dream Perspective, he could forget the things he knew and only remember the things his target would. This way, he wouldn't have his thoughts colored by bias and matters he already understood. One of the most difficult things for people to do was look at matters from the perspective of someone else. However, with Tier 4, Control, Lionel could create a dream clone in his dream world that had the exact knowledge of whoever he chose. Then, he could simulate how they would think about a situation. The more understanding he had of a person, the more accurate it would be. He could adjust his intelligence and deductive ability, as well as factor in personality and tendencies as well. But, since Lionel knew so little about his cousin, he could only draw conclusions with about 20 to 30% certainty, using an average 6-dimensional existence as his dream clone. I would be cautious. With the importance of void merits, why give a chance for this variable to pop up and bite me in the ass at all? There are too many ways to circumvent that problem. The easiest way to do things would be to shrink the deadline. Rather than a month, I would give you 2 weeks. 2 weeks is still semi-reasonable, especially since neither of us would be aware that the clinic would mark up the price so much just because of a grudge they had with me. Now that I think about it, a month is overly nice. It's possible that he's greedy, Aina supplemented, though he didn't say anything that could give away his real goal. He did say, I never touched the women of my brothers. However, I will take their money, to me. Novel Bin. Lionel's brows raised as he fell into thought again. There are too many possibilities. The problem wasn't that Lionel couldn't think of what CO might do. The real issue was that he could think of too many. And, without knowing exactly what CO knew, it was impossible to pinpoint which path he could take. For example, it would be all too easy to close the loophole he and Aina planned on using. CO would only have to be demoted back down to Aina's level, then she wouldn't be able to use void merits to escape the chains of the contract. Of course, whether CO would go so far, Lionel didn't know. But, if it was Lionel, if he could force a talent like Aina to work for him, that would be worth exchanging whatever effort it took for him to raise his level. Aina was someone who had entered 20 leaderboards in her first attempt. Where else would you find a talent like that? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. In fact, now that Lionel knew the rule book inside and out, he could even think of some methods where demoting your rank would be a benefit rather than a detriment. Since there are too many possibilities, disregard them all. Aina suddenly said. Aina blinked and looked up at Lionel with a smile. I told you before that your battle style isn't like mine. You like withholding your trump cards and only using them when you can get maximum benefit. But, I just give everything I have right from the very beginning. So what if you know what's coming? You can't stop it anyway. Lionel's gaze glowed, his heartbeat speeding up. That was right. Instead of trying to think of a counter for everything CO might do, he just needed to find a method he couldn't block no matter what. It's no wonder his spear force was so lacking. He had the disposition of an archer, not a spearman. Thought of something? Aina's smile widened. Maybe. But it will be difficult. Lionel responded. What could possibly stop us if we do it together? Aina asked. Hearing such words, what else could Lionel do other than grin? The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1427. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 24 seconds AM. Chapter 1427. Sly Brad. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Previous chapter has already been updated. It's been brought to my attention that for those that can't see the update, you can go to a profile setting a clear cache. Then the chapter will refresh. Thanks to Horst for enlightening me to this method. Lionel and Aina returned to the Senate branch, finding that the young man had yet to leave. You two again? I already warned you, you know. You can't return missions you've already taken. You're going to have to bite the bullet. If you fail to complete a mission, you not only fall in debt for 10 times what the reward would be, but you also get assigned manual labor. The time scope of the manual labor is fairly harsh, though it can sometimes be lenient. It all depends since you'll be on duty until the mission you failed is completed. Lionel's expression flickered. He could think of a ton of ways to abuse rules like that, especially if he was the head of a powerful faction. But, he also didn't plan on failing any missions, so he ignored those thoughts for now. These days, his mind worked faster than he even wanted to, so he winded down paths others wouldn't even consider before said individual could even begin deducing much of anything. We know. We just thought we'd pick out another mission to save on some time so that we can complete them all at once. The young man, who Lionel knew by name now as Dmitri, raised an eyebrow. But, he didn't question it. After Lionel and Aina had left, he looked into them to see what he had missed and he learned that these two were two of this year's only 3 amethyst token wielders. Aina's performance was shocking enough, but Lionel's was especially, well, eye-catching. If you aren't reading this on N, you're reading pirated content. Please support the official release. Though many felt that Lionel's performance was definitely fake, some more analytical individuals felt that there was more to this than met the eye. The reason was quite simple: the Void Senate and the Void Elders never attempted to close down the Void Tower. If there was something wrong with the Void Tower, wouldn't they at least close it down for a while to see what could have gone wrong? And yet right before Lionel's run and right after, everything was business as usual. It made one wonder. Did he really climb to the 74th floor? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. No matter how Dmitri scanned Lionel, he could find nothing special about him. He couldn't fathom how a 5th-dimensional kid could climb to even the 20s, let alone the 70s. It just didn't make any sense. Of course, this was one of the other odd changes Lionel had undergone. The more time he spent in this new body of his, the more subtle changes he noticed. For example, his aura and his temperament seemed to have been greatly refined, not even the tiniest bit of his aura leaked anymore. In the past, when he focused, he used to leak out King's might, causing everyone around him to feel strained and heavy. But now, he focused and nothing at all happened. He hadn't noticed earlier because Aina had always been unbothered by his King's might. But, with Dmitri here, he should have sensed or felt something. But, Lionel could tell that he hadn't. We will take the Goblin Subdimensional Zone Void mission. Dmitri was speechless as he had flashbacks to just before Lionel and Aina had left the first time. They had already had this talk once before, but Dmitri never thought that these two would come back only to ignore everything he had said the first time. He almost felt like banging his head against the wall. Had he been talking to air? Void missions could appear at all ranks from quadrant to domain. They were essentially missions that hadn't been completed within a 10-year span. Usual missions were ranked 1 to 9. Level 1 Galaxy missions were designed for Level 1 Galaxy ranked disciples, so on and so forth. A 1-star Void mission was one that hadn't been completed in 10 years of activity. A 2-star Void mission hadn't been completed in 100 years. A 3-star Void mission hadn't been completed in 1,000. And a Death Void mission was anything beyond that. The Goblin mission wasn't yet a Death Void mission, but it wasn't far from that. And, even before it became a 1-star Void mission, it had been a Level 3 Galaxy ranked mission. That level was already suicide for the likes of Lionel and Aina, leaderboard prodigies, or not. For reference, a Level 1 Galaxy ranked mission was already designed for 6th-dimensional existences. In fact, the only current 5th-dimensional existence that could be considered Galaxy ranked was Aina herself, with Lionel being unranked. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Didn't we already agree that? We changed our minds. Lionel smiled. And you're aware that, we know. Lionel smiled brighter. Fine, fine. Dmitri tossed over the mission plate and shook his head, watching the two of them leave once again. If they couldn't complete both missions they had taken within a week, they would be off to do labor. Wait. Dmitri shot up from his chair, finding the specific pendant he was looking for. He poured his internal sight into it. When he read what was on the other end, he laughed and shook his head. Huh, what a loophole. Lionel had been certain to claim the mission himself. Aina never even touched the mission plate. The trouble was that as an unranked disciple, there was nothing for the mission to be registered to. The penalties for completing a mission weren't universal. They were decided by the rank of the disciple and the rank of the mission in question. If a galaxy-ranked disciple wanted to claim a sector-ranked mission, they would not only need to pass the test, but if they failed, the punishment was actually doubled. In fact, not only were the punishments tied to your rank as a disciple, but even the location of our menial labor would be tied to it as well. After all, if they sent galaxy-ranked and sector-ranked disciples to the same place, all of the former would likely die. This meant one thing: as an unranked disciple, Lionel couldn't be punished even if he failed a mission. A sly brat indeed. Well, good luck. Most who take on void missions don't even get to return to be punished in the first place. Chapter 1428. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 23 seconds AM. Chapter 1428. Goblin Race. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel and Aina quickly made it to the location of their first mission. They chose to get the easier one out of the way first just so that they could get used to what was happening. Then they would tackle the void mission. Missions were separated into a few categories, but the main ones were land missions, zone missions, and void battlefield missions, and finally, outside missions. Land missions were missions that took place on Void Palace land itself. These could range from anything like Dimitri's job to clearing cursed beasts. Void battlefield missions spoke for themselves, while outside missions were like what Lionel's mother had undertaken to oversee the selection. If you aren't reading this on Novel by N, you're reading pirated content. Please support the official release. Finally, zone missions happened to be the category both of their couple's chosen missions fell under. These were subdimensional zones that were opened in Void Palace territory, and those that fell under this umbrella tended to be the most complex to deal with. Of course, all of the subdimensional zones of the Void Palace had long since been cleared. They no longer needed to worry about their lands being swallowed or dissolved by history. However, there were many unique zones that the Void Palace kept open with methods similar to what Valiant Heart Mountain had done. The only difference was that the Void Palace did it on a much larger scale. It had to be remembered that unique zones were defined as zones that had been influenced by outside factors. This could range from anything like outsiders entering when they shouldn't, outsiders influencing the timeline of events, and even up to keeping zones that should have been closed long ago, open. Unique zones that fell into the third category were used for their continual supplementation of resources. However, the issue was that the longer these unique zones remained open, the more twisted their inner worlds became and the more difficult they were to deal with. In order to keep the zones within manageable levels, missions were released to the disciples. So long as these missions were completed within a timely fashion, everything would be fine and the Void Palace would be able to continuously mine resources. However, in case of failure, well, there was a reason why void missions were so dangerous. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed due to their inherent qualities, zone missions tended to become void missions far more often than missions of other categories. And, likewise, they also tended to be the ones that most often became death void missions as well. Knowing this, it was no wonder that Dmitri had had just a fierce reaction. Still, Lionel and Aina had made the decision and it was already much too late to back out now. Hello. Lionel gave a small greeting to the senior manning the zone and handed over their mission plate. With a nod, the senior slotted in the force crystals necessary and opened the pathway. You have a week before the zone closes. Be sure to complete the mission before then. Lionel nodded and took Aina's hand as he jumped in, the portals swirling close after them. The senior manning the post couldn't help but blink and shake his head, trying to rid himself of the daze he fell into after noticing Aina. When Lionel's vision cleared, he found himself in the depths of a familiar forest. The soil was still a grayish-black, the surroundings were still layered in a dense fog, and the anarchic force was still thick. The only difference was that the trees were all burnt to the ground, leaving a thick heat and smell of ash and soot in the air. Up ahead, there was a looming castle built right in the face of a wall. Several sentries marched along and patrolled the area. Considering the situation, it wouldn't be long before he and Aina were found out. However, Lionel wasn't worried. This mission was the easier of the two and was only a level 1 galaxy-ranked mission. The good news about this was that thanks to the mission details, Lionel didn't need the dictionary to find out what they had to do to clear the zone. In fact, they even got a history of the situation. This chapter uploaded first at Novelbin. Not many of these zones were back before the humans conquered this region. The Void Palace was located on the frontier of the human domain. So, as one might imagine, it wasn't always in human hands. In order to claim it and push back the line of defense to the Void battlefield, many other races had to be cleared away first. This mission targeted one of these former races and also happened to be related to the goblin race he and Aina would be facing in the 3-star Void mission he had chosen. The so-called goblin race was just a nickname given to humans, and it was honestly quite derogatory, though Lionel wasn't aware of this. The true name of the race was the Dwarven race. However, the Dwarven race was unlike what Lionel was used to. They simply referred to small humanoids. Their females were known as pixies and their males were known as sparrows. They had skin ranging from dull gray to dark green, transparent wings that seemed too frail to carry their weight, and they ranged from 3 to 5 feet tall upon reaching maturity. They were well known for their speed, cunning, and their ability to build into natural barriers and constructs. This race was especially troublesome to deal with, especially when they had time to prepare. This was why the timeline of this mission was a week instead of just a day, despite the fact the goal was very straightforward: kill. Lionel exhaled a breath as a blaring horn sounded. It seemed that he and Aina had been found. He subconsciously flipped over a palm, but he shook his head in the end. His bows were in the segmented cube before the incident and his spears were all locked away thanks to the volatile atmosphere in the spear domain ring. Readjusting himself, Lionel flipped a palm again, a familiar spear landing in his hand. This spear was the very same stinger-like spear he had gained after becoming a woman during his spear domain trial. He couldn't help but laugh when he remembered the ridiculousness of the situation. Since then, he had experienced becoming a woman more times than he could count, but now was the time to linger on that. It was time to see how this new body of his performed. He turned to Aina and grinned before they both bolted forward. Chapter 1429. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 21 seconds AM. Chapter 1429. Feel LT if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel shot forward and his head almost snapped back as though someone had just pressed on the gas. His speed was so fast that he almost didn't believe that it was being generated from his own legs. What was the most shocking about it was the fact that his weight hadn't been lowered in the slightest, unlike what had happened when his snowy star owl lineage factor's speed branch reached its peak. Somehow, he managed to hit this pace with his weight being just as great as it had been before. He appeared before the castle walls almost too quickly. Realizing that he would crash if he didn't adjust, Lionel focused, his thighs bulging as he leapt into the air. Wah! Lionel let out a gasp. Before he realized what was happening, he was already 50 meters in the air, his eyes opened wide. Jumping 50 meters into the air wasn't a big deal if he was in a fifth-dimensional world. He might even be able to replicate the feat if he put his all into it in a sixth-dimensional world. But, just now, he thought he had already adjusted himself to his new strength, so he used even less than he thought he should. And yet, the result was still like this. Lionel suddenly understood. The speed of the starry-tailed fox was amazing, but somehow it was still secondary compared to its leaping, directional change, and agility abilities. He laughed in the skies, making it to almost 60 meters before he began to fall downward. Aina clicked her tongue, still quite far behind Lionel. She had adjusted her speed based on what output she was used to Lionel producing. This was clearly also outside her expectations. This chapter uploaded first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Calm to experience faster update speed. She smiled lightly after a moment, her body becoming enveloped in a fog of crimson as she exploded forth, her palm flipping over to reveal her axe. In the skies, Lionel's gaze flashed, his vision suddenly able to see through everything. His internal sight enveloped the entire mountain castle as several arrows shot toward him. Lionel brandished his spear, its feather fluttering in the wind as he pierced forward. Protected by his spear force, he met the tip of each and every arrow, his speed leaving afterimages in the air as he thought back to the style of the primitive woman. It had been so long since he sunk into her thoughts, and yet he was back there again as though the first time he touched the spear was just yesterday. He seemed to be able to grasp many subtleties he had completely missed back when he was just in the third dimension. No, he hadn't just missed them, it was like he wasn't looking for them at all. The truth was that even now, he wasn't looking for them. It was just that his senses were so far superior to what they had been back then that he almost had no choice but to notice. The subtle but powerful twist of her hips, the way her feet grinded into the ground as though to gain the support of the earth with her every strike, the almost insignificant flex and turn of her wrist just before her strike landed. For a moment, Lionel was in a daze. The process felt eerily similar to him. How different was brandishing a spear compared to throwing a football? Or, more pertinently, a javelin? The mechanisms were slightly different, but the methods and foundation of drawing up and producing power were nearly identical. Visit N0 Velbin. Net or No Velbin. Com for the best novel reading experience. He could draw on the same concepts, that natural motion that came as easy as breathing to him. He never had to think when he drew his bow or when he cocked his arm back to release the draconic power in his arm, but that was also because he had drilled the latter so many times that it came so naturally. When had he ever put so much effort into the spear? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. And what about the former? With a bow, much of the mechanics were taken out of his hands, but now that he thought about it, there were many small tweaks he could make to his bowmanship that could take him to a different level entirely. The bow was only more forgiving because he could make up all his mechanical flaws with his calculative abilities. Who cared if his arm wasn't straight, if his back wasn't tight, if his shoulders weren't steady, if he could always just adjust the angle or his bow force so that his aim was true every time? Lionel went through all these thoughts in just the split moment it took for him to fall onto the castle walls. In just those small split seconds, his entire demeanor had shifted and changed, his approach changing entirely. He had the perfect ability to perfect his mechanics to an absolute extreme, and yet he had never used it. He would change that. Starting right now. Lionel stomped down hard, his hair fluttering and his aura becoming restrained. He pierced forward, his spear force jetting forward and leaving a hole in the heads of 2 sparrows and a pixie. Their small frames and ridiculous speed and agility was exactly the kind of challenge he needed right now. Lionel restrained his aura even further, not relying on any force other than his spear force and lowering his speed even further. These were just 5th-dimensional enemies for now. He wouldn't be satisfied until his skill alone could overwhelm them. Come. His base was steady, his wrists flexed and his back tall. He walked forward like a mountain, his every pierce becoming more refined, the wind around him shifting as a slight auspicious air began to form as he became more focused. By the 10th pierce, Lionel had reflected the skill of the primitive woman perfectly. Every twitch of the muscle, every subtle movement, even the angle she grinded her feet into the ground at. But he wasn't satisfied. There was more here. He could feel it. Chapter 1430. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 20 seconds AM. Chapter 1430. Whistle if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel's spear flew like a jet stream, leaving blurs in the air as he pierced through head after head. His lethality only increased, and yet his speed seemed to only become slower. It wasn't a surprise that Lionel had only taken 10 pierces to reach the level of the primitive woman. After all, his ability index was perfect for this, and this was ultimately just a black-grade weapon. But, he still basked in the feeling. He could sense it, there was a level beyond. There was a level that represented why this woman's spear would be in the spear domain. This wasn't enough to gain the acknowledgement of the spear, there was something he was still missing. 3 sparrows shot toward Lionel, each of them just 4 feet tall. But, because they were all flying low to the ground, their heights were no less than that of Lionel. 2 wielded short swords and the last was an archer who lagged behind. These 3 were most definitely more powerful than the ones Lionel had been fighting until this point, each of them in the latter third of the 5th dimension, beyond even Lionel's tier 6 level. However, Lionel didn't flinch, his pale violet irises twinkling with a hidden light as the auspicious air around him thickened. This chapter upload daily at Novel Next. Net his spear shot outward, releasing 6 streaks in quick succession. The wooden polearm bent and wove through the air like an elegant thread, matching the trajectory Lionel could see being projected onto the real world in real time. Clang! 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 The 2 swordsmen defended for their lives, their wings flapping hard as they were pushed back. An arrow flew between their head, aiming for Lionel's head before he could follow up. But, with just as much ease, Lionel tilted to the side, his spear tilting upward from a low trajectory, piercing toward the chin of one of the sparrows. Lionel's eyes suddenly widened, his blood rushing through his veins. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. That was it, that felt so good. He was washed with a feeling of euphoria even before his stinger blade shot through the lower jaw of the sparrow, exiting out the back of his skull. It was almost like Lionel had felt the success before it landed, like it was a perfect move the skies had blessed him with. It was a sort of emotion Lionel had never experienced before and it left him on cloud 9. He pulled his spear back, his attacks suddenly becoming less predictable and more erratic. His rhythm shifted and moved like an elegant dance to music that jumped and warped. Sometimes it was fierce, at other times calm, and at yet other times it was ignited with a fiery passion that almost made Lionel's loins burn with the same heat. He could remember the seduction of the primitive woman, how scantily clad she was, how much grace and beauty she carried through with her every movement. Her pores oozed with charm, her steps fusing with her moving and leaving her enemies in a trance. It was suddenly so obvious to Lionel. How was it that the primitive woman could make a spear that could do nothing but pierce so powerful? It sounded quite ridiculous. Without any sort of variation, how could it be difficult to contend with her? But now, it was before Lionel as bright as day. There were many ways to vary one's attacks without using a different attack at all. You could change your cadence, your rhythm, you could even shift how much power you used, pushing and pulling at the instincts of an enemy until you lured them to a cliff and blew them a soft kiss as they fell off. Lionel's expression turned weird, breaking out of his trance. He shot a hand away from his spear, snatching at the air and grabbing an arrow out of the wind before it could pierce his brows. He laughed to himself, his laugh becoming louder and louder until the castle itself began to rock as the earth force that made up its foundation threatened to quake to the point the entire structure would come crumbling down. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Lionel had immersed himself in the thoughts of the primitive woman to the point that he truly almost blew out a kiss mid-battle. Suddenly, Aina let out a whistle to his back. Why did you stop? I was enjoying the show. Lionel looked back to find Aina's face red from laughter as severed corpses fell around her. She was wheezing to the point Lionel thought snot might fly from her nose at any moment now, yet she still somehow managed to remain gorgeous. Show me more of what those swaying hips can do. Lionel's lip twitched. It seemed that he had immersed himself more than he thought. But soon, a sly grin spread across his face. If you want to see what my hips can do, you only needed to ask. Sure, sure. Aina laughed. Do you want me to be top or bottom? Funny. Well, see if you're still laughing in the end or if you'll be looking at me with those puppy dog eyes again. Aina coughed through her laughter before jumping over the side of the castle wall. You'll never get to see either of them if you can't keep up. She shouted out as she fell. Lionel flicked his wrist, sending the arrow he had caught through the brows of the pixie that had shot it at him before rushing after Aina. A smile was plastered all over his face. This was far more fun than he had had in a while. Since Aina had already seen him in such an embarrassing state, he might as well also show her the flexibility technique he learned from Valiant Heart Mountain. Even though he hadn't used it in a while, he thought it would be a useful way to get that smug smile on her face to turn into a lustful scream. Lionel's body flashed, a streak of gold being left in his wake, his spear's light severing everything in its path. Chapter 1431. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 19 seconds AM. Chapter 1431. Familiar Senior. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. I uploaded this chapter hours ago but for some reason it didn't register. I guess I misclicked. Either that or WN glitched. Anywho, here you go. Lionel and Aina stood back to back in an elaborate throne room. Making it here wouldn't have been too difficult, if the construction of the castle hadn't been so conniving and vindictive. Describing the layout of an inanimate object like this might feel like a bridge too far, but if Lionel had the dictionary or wise star order to explain it to him, he would understand that the dwarven race had always been like this. Even if it wasn't for all the sinister traps and lurking dangers, the design of the castle alone would have been enough to drive the two of them crazy. The reality of the matter was that from the very beginning, the castle was designed for people half their size. Aina was just a bit over 6 feet tall herself, while Lionel was over 2 meters tall. The number of times they found themselves ducking or getting stuck in cramped locations was too much to count. Luckily, the throne room was a vast and wide hall. Unluckily, there were a swarm of protective knights and soldiers that would rather die than see Lionel and Aina kill their king and queen. That led to the current situation where the both of them were surrounded by swarms in the hundreds. Let alone to their fronts, backs and sides, they were even assaulted from above. In truth, this mission was designed for a team of 8 to take it on at the first or second tier of the 6th dimension. It was already quite ridiculous that the two of them had chosen to take it on. But that didn't stop the both of them from grinning ear to ear all the while, as the saying went, the couple that slays together, stays together. Lionel and Aina walked out of the portal side by side, a healthy sheen of sweat coating their bodies. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed visit N0 Velbin. Net. For the best novel reading experience. The senior manning the gate once again found himself stunned. But this time it wasn't due to Aina's beauty, but rather the time. The mission was meant to take a week for 6th-dimensional existence. Though the senior was aware that Lionel and Aina were in the 5th dimension, it wasn't too rare for more talented quadrant-ranked disciples to take on lower-class galaxy-ranked missions. While it was true that most of them died as well, it wasn't this senior's job to try and save them. He didn't get paid nearly enough to deal with uppity geniuses who thought too much of themselves. Sometimes, though, these geniuses would manage to survive, if only barely, and he would give a slight nod of approval. However, even among that number, he would very rarely see them try again without an ample grace period. Something like this, though, where a pair went into an 8-person mission and came out completely unscathed outside of some heavy breathing. It was unheard of. Lionel smiled, reaching out a hand to get their mission plate back. Ah. Right. Yes. The senior handed over the plate, which had subtly changed in color. Such a thing would only happen after the mission was, indeed, completed. So now he was absolutely certain that there wasn't a mistake. He could only watch silently as the two walked away, his heart beating slightly faster than usual. The Void Palace was already a location where geniuses all came together from across the human domain. Even the youth at the lowest rung of his place was an overlord back at his home. To see 2 individuals who could even stand at the very top here. The senior glanced at his checkbook and made note of their names. In the future, this tidbit of information just might make him quite a bit of money in any one of their gambling dens. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Lionel checked their gains and nodded to himself. That mission was among the harder one in the 1st galaxy rank, so their returns weren't bad. The two of them had made 70,000 void points. While that was only a few dozen percentage points better more than what Lionel had made with the spatial bristle rings, it was still a great sum. Lionel didn't expect to make a great amount, he just wanted enough so that he and Aina could finally switch out of their beast skin clothing. As great as his crafting was, because he had yet to learn how to counter anarchic force, there was only so long his force arts could last before degrading. Right now, the only reason their clothing hadn't fallen apart was because they made it was cursed beast fur to begin with. That aside, as great as it was staring at Aina's long legs and toned belly all day, he was starting to get tired of running into people whose eyeballs threatened to pop out of their skulls. Soon, Lionel and Aina had swapped into the galaxy-ranked uniforms of the Void Palace. The layered robes and deep violet-black colors made Lionel feel quite good. In addition, they were only 1,000 void points each since it was a mass-produced product. Plus, higher-level disciples rarely wore the uniform to begin with unless on official business representing the Void Palace, so there was no point in marking up prices. I can also exchange for robes of any rank I want because of my limbo state. Lionel smiled to himself, tucking it into the back of his mind. Following this, Lionel and Aina used the rest of their points to exchange for healing items. Both had insane healing factors, but they still chose to err on the side of caution. Lionel also insisted on buying Aina some flexible armor as well as her defenses were weaker than his own. With that completed along with a small rest, the two of them nodded toward one another and stepped toward a desolate region almost devoid of students. Up ahead, a singular senior stood, but this senior happened to be one that Lionel was almost too familiar with. His gaze narrowed, a slight killing intent manifesting around him in a subtle sheen of red. Aina blinked, taking note of the change. That was definitely not something Lionel had ever done before. When she saw who was ahead, though, she came to an understanding. It was none other than the envoy of the Void Palace, Orinik. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1432. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 17 seconds AM. Chapter 1432. Lucky star. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel had known for a very long time that Orinik was the one that had spread information about how he had gotten his amethyst token. In reality, Lionel didn't care much about this alone. After all, Orinik was telling the truth, he didn't spin a lie. Lionel had, indeed, used his connections to gain his token. However, the matters of back then were quite a bit more complex than others knew. While Miguel hadn't used the innate node during their battle, Lionel hadn't used his ability index. When Lionel's ability index was active, he could even defeat 6-dimensional existences while at tier 1 of the 5th dimension. Of course, those 6-dimensional existences couldn't possibly match up to the 6-dimensional existence of the Void Palace. But, Miguel hadn't been in the 6th dimension back then either. On top of that, if Miguel had insisted on using his innate node, he would have lost even faster. Even back then, Lionel was already completely immune to the 4th-dimensional Scarlet Star Force Miguel had access to. And, he was completely immune to destruction runes in general. This was all to say that if Lionel hadn't wanted to fight a thrilling battle, he could have made it very boring and left without suffering the injuries Orinik seemed to look down on him for suffering. While Lionel could admit that he would have still been lacking compared to the other true geniuses of the Void Palace back then, he had also never denied that. His problem with Orinik was the fact that his actions put Lionel's life and death in the line of fire, something he was well aware of. Lionel's life and death was one matter, but he also had the weight of the others on his shoulders during the first part of the true selection. If Lionel really hadn't had the strength of an amethyst token wielder back then not only would he have died, but their entire sector would have been wiped out, all because of this man before him. Lionel's steps didn't falter as he stepped forward. Orinik's gaze narrowed as well, but neither said a single word, at least not for the moment. When Lionel stepped before Orinik, he handed over his mission plate, causing Orinik's expression to change. Orinik had originally thought that Lionel had come here for revenge. It made sense, this place was quite secluded and disciples almost never came here. His job was more of a formality, another easy job he managed to land thanks to his connections. Everyone knew that this mission was practically suicide and higher-level disciples weren't allowed to go backward and complete void missions after promoting past their rank. The only exception to this rule was if a void mission had grown to the point that access to the resource would be lost without action. But, in those cases, the rewards usually tied to void missions were discontinued. However, Lionel needed this mission. Aina was right, rather than leaving things in the hands of others, they should go all out and leave no doubt. Complete void missions came with a special reward where one could request a rule break from the Senate. With the exception of a pardon for killing, you could pardon anything else. The only catch was that the person in need of a pardon had to clear a void mission of their rank, and a pardon couldn't be used on behalf of another person. Depending on the star level of the void mission, you received a certain level of pardon. To void a contract, you needed a 3-star void mission, so this was the only choice. Obviously, Lionel wanted to help Aina clear this void mission so that they wouldn't have to fall into whatever schemes Sio might or might not have concocted. After a few moments, Orinik, who had been ready to teach Lionel and Aina that there was still a large gap between levels of galaxy-ranked disciples, relaxed. So long as the two of them got themselves killed, he wouldn't even need to bother looking over his shoulder anymore. His lip curled. He didn't even ask any questions, nor did he try to talk them out of it like someone else might. Plus, even if he did, they were pretty much finished anyway. You couldn't retract a mission without having a 1-star pardon. And, if you failed a mission, you would end up doing manual labor until it was cleared. Considering this mission hadn't been cleared in over 1,000 years, they would be mining until they were old and gray. Orinik almost couldn't believe his luck. His problems were wrapping themselves in a neat little bow. It was beautiful. The portal whirred to life for the first time in a long time. Orinik's hands were practically a blur as he worked, as though he was scared that Lionel would change his mind. Lionel watched this coldly, not saying a single word and his expression not giving anything away as he thought of how he would deal with Orinik in the future. After a careless glance, he took Aina's hand and disappeared into the portal. When it closed, Orinik almost couldn't hold himself back from laughing. It was only after he managed to rein in his mad cackle that his mind began to spin. He had made it to his current level by biding his time, backstabbing when he should and retreating when he should. He had made quite a pretty penny selling out information about Lionel and making him public enemy number 1 during his true selection. Even if it wasn't Lionel, someone entering a 3-star void mission was already a money-making machine. The fact that it was the son of Velasco and the rising star Aina Brazinger who had entered made Orinik feel like he could practically print his own money. I can take advantage of this. This was the second reason he had pulled strings to net himself this job outside of its ease. There was money to be made. There should be a week until the portal told him they had failed. In that time, he had more than enough leeway to start a betting ring. With Aina's and the Morales names, the number of people who would join wasn't small at all. In fact, there might even be some sector-ranked disciples that joined. Orinik almost rubbed his hands together. Lionel was his lucky star. He just had to milk this star before it inevitably died. Chapter 1433. Published at 6th of December 2022 8:05 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1433. Familiar scene. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel and Aina had no idea that they were being used by Orinik once again. And, even if they did know, they wouldn't have the luxury of thinking too much about it because almost the instant they stepped through the portal, they found themselves being thrown into a bed of hot oil. Their first mission had placed them right in enemy territory, something that wasn't so bad considering the enemies they faced were still weak and manageable. However, when this void mission chose to do the very same thing, it was much less of a funny matter. Almost the instant Lionel and Aina appeared, they were surrounded by 5 6-dimensional members of the dwarven race, their strength layering down with an oppressive might. Just as wise Star Order had said, most races outside of humans had maximized their evolution down one path, and as such, they tended to share the same ability indexes, lineages factors, and overall strengths. The Raypaks were often born with explosive power and flexibility, the ability indexes falling in line to maximize their strengths. Pixies and sparrows, however, had extremely sharp eyes, high dexterity, agility, and speed. The first two helped greatly with their crafting and their traps. The latter two were exceptionally difficult to handle in battle. They tended to be excellent swordsmen and archers, not to mention assassins. The main reason that Lionel had chosen this 3-star void mission in particular was so that they could use their first mission to get used to the battle style of the pixies and sparrows. But the leap in skill and danger was so large that he felt he was naive to have thought it would be very helpful. P.S. If you guys don't read this on novel com and read somewhere else, I will want you and quill you. Well, retreat first, Lionel called out to Aina. Only step where I step, then well cut a path outward. Lionel's palm flipped over to reveal his stinger spear, his gaze flashing with a blaze of glory as he unleashed a barrage of piercing strikes. Almost instantly, the two archers of the ground reacted, each brandishing 2 arrows wrapped in vines. They communicated with their eyes seamlessly, releasing their bowstrings in a breath. Lionel's eyes glowed when he saw this scene. Despite the danger, he felt that these two had truly become one with their bows. When they inhaled, their bowstrings were pulled tight. When they exhaled, their attacks were released, following the trajectory of their gazes as though being controlled by nothing more than their wills. Beautiful, Lionel's spear force shattered apart beneath the twisted level 2 bow force. They tore apart the impurities and faults in his blade force as though it was nothing more than dried weed. Lionel took note of their target, taking a strong step forward and allowing light to envelop him. Right now wasn't the time for training, he had to go all out or else he and Aina would be buried here. Right this moment, they were stuck in a familiar forest with yet another castle built into the face of a mountain to their backs. It was clear that this was a staple of the dwarven race. But this one was far more elaborate than the last, and the powerhouses protecting this one were on a completely different level. This wasn't something that Lionel and Aina could just barge their way through. They needed to plan, scope out the situation, get a lay of the land, and approach with purpose. Lionel's pupils dilated, his pale violet irises waking up. They shimmering like 2 purple torches in the darkness as Lionel's canines grew. Bang! Lionel exploded forward, his speed completely unlike what it had been before. The 2 archers didn't even get the chance to pull their bowstrings again before their throats were pierced through. Lionel blazed a trail by them, Aina enveloping herself in a cloak of red as she shot ahead as well, the heads of 3 swordsmen flying. Lionel didn't even look back as 5 orbs of scarlet star force forms and enveloped their bodies and blood before they could even touch the ground. He knew that this wasn't a video game. He had to make sure that he and Aina left no traces behind to give their enemies the least amount of time to prepare. Their ashes scattered into the wind as the 2 disappeared over the horizon. Mere seconds later, another squad of pixies and sparrows appeared, only to furrow their brows when they found nothing at all. They could have sworn that there was a commotion here, but now there was absolutely nothing. What was going on, exactly? It would be several hours before they realized that an entire scouting unit had vanished. But, by then, Lionel and Aina would be long gone. Lionel exhaled a breath, landing on a thin branch. Not long afterward, Aina landed on a tree across from him, putting her axe away to stop it from snapping in 2. At the moment, her brows were a bit furrowed. She realized that this would be difficult. If they didn't have a time limit, they could just take their time. But they only had a week or this would be considered a failure. The good news was that in a controlled zone like this one, failing just meant they would be ejected. The bad news was that failure also meant manual labor, not to mention a heavy monetary penalty. Lionel suddenly laughed. Worried about failing? A bit. Don't worry about it, Aina's brows rose as she listened to Lionel's explanation. Eventually, she started laughing too, her body becoming far more relaxed. She believed in them as a pair, but something about the looming potential punishment still made her feel suffocated. Now knowing it didn't matter if they failed, she was far more relaxed and composed. She still had the weight of her mother's revenge on her shoulders, and she also cared about Lionel achieving his goals as well. Something like being stuck doing menial labor for hundreds of years wasn't something she could accept. She would rather fall out with the Void Palace and kill herself a path out. So what do we do first? First, I'll do some scouting. Stay here, I'll be back within an hour. After that, it'll be the same as usual. The couple grinned at each other, seemingly liking the scent of blood a bit too much. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1434. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:36 and 53 seconds AM Chapter 1434 If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel flashed through the trees. He kept his light force restrained as much as possible. The atmosphere was a huge help to him, there was no reason for him to ruin it for himself. In the past, he had hated the atmosphere of the Void Palace. But right now, the perpetual darkness, the heavy fog, and the restrained internal sight was a huge benefit to his stealth right this moment. Instead of projecting it, Lionel allowed this new light force to circulate through his nodes. It felt weird no longer having snow force within him. But the unique light force of the starry-tailed fox was so far beyond it that he was sure he would get used to it very quickly. Not only did this light force boost his speed for more than snow force ever did, its passive healing was unlike anything Lionel had ever experienced before, and it was also certain that its potency in battle was on a completely different level as well. Lionel could see images of a majestic illusory fox with 3 long spiritual tails, sweeping out a claw that collapsed solar systems. The blades of light traveled through even space itself, tearing apart everything in its path. This unique light force practically spoke its name into his mind. Ethereal Star Force. In that moment, Lionel understood just what kind of weight this force held. His starry spirit domain, powered by ethereal star force, made him immune to internal sight on his level. That meant that only someone with 7th-dimensional internal sight, or 6th-dimensional internal sight stronger than his own, could detect him. Grasping this truth, Lionel became more confident in his scouting mission. Though this ability wasn't as strong as the Raypack's immunity, it wasn't far. So long as he stayed out of sight, he would be fine. He understood now that ethereal star force wasn't just a light and star force mixture. It was also a space force mixture. It was just unfortunate that his dimension was too weak to make use of its spatial properties just yet, but this much was enough for now. Soon, the castle appeared before Lionel. As expected, he appeared as its further right edge where the scouting units were the thinnest. He closed his eyes and unfurled his internal sight. Another benefit of the Wisdom Spirit branch was that his internal sight had also become far more difficult to detect as well, so he didn't hold back in the slightest. If he really ran into someone with stronger internal sight than his own, he would simply directly give up. Such an existence wasn't something that he and Aina would be able to beat. He would then use his loophole to avoid punishment. The senses of the dwarven race seemed to be very good, something Lionel had experienced during both missions already. So, it wasn't absolutely impossible for him to run into such an individual. Luckily, even after sweeping through the whole castle, Lionel didn't find such a person. However, his expression didn't relax in the slightest. This castle is far more elaborate. Even with my internal sight improving to hundreds of meters under the influence of anarchic force, I still can't see the whole layout. It's also far deeper underground than the last one was as well, and the traps, the ones I can detect, anyway, are also far more elaborate. I'll need to move to 3 more locations to get the full scope. Lionel finished his calculations quickly, deducing how many more spots he needed to visit to get the full layout. Then, he moved. In order to complete this mission, they need to crush the power structure of this base. That meant they needed to kill all 8 generals, all 4 dukes, and both the king and queen. Obviously, though, the situation was more complex than that since each of them was heavily protected. From what Lionel saw, they wouldn't need to enter the castle to deal with the 8 generals. But the 4 dukes and the king and queen were all located within the castle. The upper half of the castle was split into the north, south, east and west directions. These were controlled by the dukes. The underground layout was far more elaborate and far more protected. That region was the location of the king and queen. In dwarven culture, darkness and being closer to the earth was seen as noble, something that was ironic considering they tended to fly in the air in battle. Either way, knowing this, it made sense why the king and queen would be so far underground. It might be smarter to tackle the king and queen first. Once they're dead, the dukes will begin fighting over power, simultaneously splitting the generals as well. This was the conclusion Lionel came to after finishing his scouting. From a cursory glance, the north, south, East and West Duke had a bit of a rivalry going on. If he poked at this, he could benefit them. From the very beginning, Lionel's approach was far different from others. Most took out the generals first, then the dukes, before targeting the monarchy if they even got that far to begin with. But Lionel hadn't even considered doing this for more than a moment. Like a madman, he chose to complete the hardest task first. When he returned to Aina and explained his plans, she agreed immediately. When it came to such plans, she would always leave it up to Lionel. Her only issues arose when he didn't explain himself. But with things like this, she was fully on board. "Alright, give me some time. If we're going to do this, I can't go in without a bow." "You should just steal one," Aina suggested. "They're too small," Lionel shook his head. "After using a longbow, I can't imagine going back." The white lion bow was 3 meters tall, even his bronze-grade black bow was that tall. But the bows of the dwarven race were half that size often. He would have to carve his own. But how would he craft without little Tali? Lionel didn't regret using their void points on Aina's armor instead of a bow for him. Now, though, he needed to find a solution. He exhaled a breath. It seemed he would have to improvise. As Lionel and Aina were preparing for their raid, a small commotion had already begun to buzz in the Void Palace's galaxy region as Orynyx advertising began to spread like wildfire. You're tuning in to the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.